Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. I run a smoothie bar in a small town, the kind of place where people chat about local gossip and the barista knows your usual. It's nothing fancy, just fresh fruits, good vibes, and the occasional special request from health nuts asking for chia seeds or spirulina. My life was routine, comfortable, predictable, until that one day. It started like any other. The sun was shining, birds chirping, and I was prepping fruits for the day. Pineapples, mangoes, strawberries, everything was in order. Then I reached into the last crate, expecting another batch of mangoes, but instead I pulled out a fruit I'd never seen before. It looked like a cross between a peach and a plum, deep red, almost black. Its skin was slightly fuzzy, and when I cut into it, the flesh was a bright, unnatural red, like blood, but somehow more vibrant. Curious, I shrugged and figured I'd give it a go. I tossed the fruit into the blender with some spinach, a banana, and a little almond milk, standard stuff. But when I hit the blend button, something strange happened. Instead of the usual soft, whirring noise, the blender roared to life, like it was grinding up rocks. The ingredients inside swirled, the colors blending together, and when it stopped, the smoothie was purple. Not just any purple, but a deep, almost glowing shade that I'd never seen in any smoothie before. It was mesmerizing. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the vibrant concoction. There was something about it, something off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Still, it was just a smoothie, right? Probably some weird reaction from the fruit. I poured it into a glass and set it on the counter, waiting for the first customer to arrive. As if on cue, in walked Karen, a regular. She always got the green power smoothie and talked my ear off about her Pilates class or her kids. Today, though, she eyed the purple drink with curiosity. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the glass. "Honestly, no idea," I said, laughing nervously. "New fruit. Want to try it?" "On the house." She grinned and took the glass without a second thought. I watched as she took a long sip, her eyes widening as the flavor hit her. "This is amazing," she said, her voice a little too enthusiastic. "What's in it?" Some spinach, banana, almond milk, and that fruit." I pointed to the weird peach plum thing on the counter. Karen finished the smoothie in minutes, smacking her lips as if she couldn't get enough of it. She thanked me, left her usual tip, and went on her way. I didn't think much of it, but that night, everything changed. The next morning, Karen came back, but she looked different. Her skin was pale, and dark circles had formed under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in days. She walked up to the counter, her usual energy replaced with something unsettling. "Hey, Karen, you all right?" I asked, concerned. She gave me a weak smile. "I had the weirdest dream last night." I leaned in, intrigued. "Yeah? What happened?" She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was searching for something. "I was in this place. It was dark, but the sky, if you could call it that, was purple like that smoothie. And there were these figures. They didn't have faces, but I knew they were watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe." A chill ran down my spine. "That's intense. Maybe it was just a bad dream." Karen shook her head. It felt real. Like I was there. Like they were real. I tried to brush it off, but something about the way she said it stuck with me. After she left, I stared at that weird fruit sitting on the counter. It seemed to almost glow under the shop lights. Was it possible? Could the fruit be causing this? Over the next few days, more people came in and tried the purple smoothie. Everyone who drank it had similar stories, strange dreams of a dark place, a purple sky, and faceless figures watching them. Some said they heard whispers in the dreams. Others said they felt paralyzed, unable to wake up. It wasn't long before word spread around town, and people started coming in just to try the dream smoothie, as they started calling it. At first, I thought it was all just some weird coincidence, but the more I heard, the more unsettled I became. One night, I decided to close up early. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I needed to figure out what was happening. I grabbed the last of the weird fruit, threw it in the blender, and made myself a smoothie. It had the same deep purple hue, the same mesmerizing glow. I took a deep breath and drank it. That night, I had the dream. I was in a place that felt endless, like a void. The ground was black, the sky a swirling mass of purple clouds. It wasn't night, but it wasn't day either, just a strange, dim twilight. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was walking through water. Then I saw them, the figures. They stood in the distance, faceless, motionless, watching. At first, I thought they were too far away to reach me, but then I felt it. A pull. It was like they were dragging me toward them, without moving, without touching me. Panic set in, but I couldn't scream, couldn't run. The closer I got, the more I could hear something, a whisper, growing louder. But I couldn't make out the words. Then one of the figures moved. It lifted its arm, pointing at me, and that's when I realized the whispers weren't coming from them. They were coming from inside my own head. "Come back," they said. "Come back." I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, but the feeling didn't leave me. It stayed, gnawing at me, even after I got up and tried to shake it off. The whispers, the pull, it felt too real. The next day, I swore off the weird fruit. I tossed the last of it into the trash, but the dreams didn't stop. And I wasn't the only one. Karen stopped coming in altogether, and when I asked around, people said she hadn't been seen in days. Others who had tried the smoothie reported the same thing. They were having the dreams every night, and each time they got worse. Some even claimed they were waking up with bruises, as if something had grabbed them in their sleep. One night, as I was closing up, I heard a knock on the door. It was Karen. She looked worse than ever, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming for us," she whispered. "What? Who?" I asked, my stomach twisting with dread. "The figures," she said. "They're not just in the dreams. They're real. I can feel them, even when I'm awake." I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't listen. She backed away, shaking her head. "You need to stop. You need to stop serving that smoothie. It's not just dreams. They want something from us." That was the last time I saw Karen. A few days later, I heard that she'd disappeared. No one knew where she went, but I had a feeling I did. I tried to close the smoothie bar for good, but it was too late. The fruit had already taken hold of too many people, and no matter how hard I tried to get rid of it, it kept coming back. The crates would show up at my doorstep, the fruit fresh and glowing, waiting to be blended. And every night, I had the same dream. The figures were getting closer, their whispers louder, their pull stronger. Now, I'm afraid to sleep. I know that one day I won't wake up. And when that happens, I'll be with them, in that place, under the purple sky, forever. The worst part, I don't think I'll be alone. I've always considered myself a bit of a loner, which is probably why I took up landscape photography. There's something peaceful about wandering into the wilderness with nothing but a camera and my own thoughts. No distractions, just me, nature, and the click of the shutter. I've captured sunrises that could make you weep, forests so dense they seemed to swallow the light, and mountain ranges that looked like something out of a dream. But this was something else. It all started about 2 weeks ago. I was hiking deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever gone before, chasing the golden hour. I had this idea of photographing an untouched clearing at sunset, something that would show the light filtering through the trees like a natural spotlight. I'd followed an old logging trail, one that had probably been forgotten years ago. My GPS was spotty at best, and I had no service, but that was normal for these kinds of trips. After walking for a few hours, I found it. The perfect spot. The trees were spaced out just enough for the sunlight to pour in, the ground was covered in soft moss, and there was a strange, gnarled tree right in the middle of the clearing. It looked ancient, its bark twisted and worn, with thick roots clawing into the earth like skeletal fingers. As I got closer, something about the tree caught my eye. Its bark wasn't smooth or cracked like most old trees. No, this tree had shapes, almost like faces, or at least the impressions of faces. And the eyes, well, the things that looked like eyes, seemed to follow me as I circled it. I laughed it off, figuring my mind was just playing tricks on me. After all, it had been a long hike, and I was tired. I set up my camera, taking a few shots of the clearing. The light was perfect, the angles just right. But every time I framed the tree, it gave me a strange, uneasy feeling. I shook it off and snapped a few more shots before deciding to call it a day. It wasn't until I reviewed the photos later that night that I noticed something odd. The first shot looked fine. The tree was dead center, with the clearing perfectly illuminated by the setting sun. But in the second photo, the eyes on the bark had moved. They weren't where I remembered them being. I chalked it up to me being overly tired and zoomed in. That's when I saw it. The eyes, there were at least 4 sets, were looking directly at the camera. They weren't just shapes anymore. They had detail, depth, almost as if the tree was aware of me. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept telling myself it was just a weird visual effect, something that happened with the lighting, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go back. The trail was harder to follow this time, as if the forest itself was shifting around me, but I eventually made it back to the clearing. The tree was still there, standing silently in the center like some kind of sentinel. This time, though, the air felt heavier. The sunlight didn't quite reach the ground, and the clearing, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt wrong. I approached the tree slowly, my camera at the ready. The eyes were there, staring at me again. I snapped a photo, then another and another. Every time the eyes shifted slightly, following my every move. It was subtle, but it was there. I could feel it. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the clearing, rustling the leaves. It wasn't the kind of wind that comes from a change in the weather. No, this wind felt unnatural, like it was carrying whispers. I stepped back, feeling my heart race. I wasn't alone. I packed up quickly and started to leave, but something stopped me. The tree. I swear I heard it creak, almost like it was trying to say something. My hands trembled as I pulled out my camera for one last shot. The instant I clicked the shutter, a deafening crack split the air. The tree's bark began to ripple and shift, the faces on its surface contorting into expressions of agony. The eyes blinked. All of them. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as the tree's roots began to writhe, twisting and curling toward me like snakes. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not stopping until I was well out of the woods and back at my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I didn't go back for days. Every time I thought about it, my skin crawled. But the photos, I couldn't stop looking at them. The eyes were alive in each shot, following me, staring, waiting. It was as if the tree was calling to me, pulling me back. I knew I should delete the pictures, but I couldn't. I felt like I needed to know more. A week later, I gave in. Armed with a sense of dread, but a need for answers, I returned to the clearing. This time, the atmosphere was even darker, like the forest itself had shifted to something sinister. The tree was still there, but now, the faces on its bark were clearer, the eyes more defined. I took a step closer, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No, hunted. The tree loomed over me, its presence almost suffocating. Against my better judgment, I reached out and touched the bark. It was warm. Too warm. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The eyes snapped open, all of them, wide and frantic, darting from side to side before locking onto mine. The ground beneath me trembled as the tree groaned, its bark splitting open with a sickening crack. From within, something began to emerge. At first, it looked like roots, long and sinewy, but as they crawled out of the tree's opening, I realized they weren't roots at all. They were arms, dozens of them, pale and clawed, reaching out toward me. I froze, unable to move, as the faces on the tree screamed silently, their mouths stretching wide in soundless agony. I stumbled back, but the arms were faster. They snaked around my legs, pulling me closer to the tree. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the gaping maw of the tree opening wider, ready to swallow me whole. When I woke up, it was dark. I was still in the clearing, but something had changed. The tree was gone. In its place, there was nothing but a patch of bare earth, as if it had never been there at all. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, and ran back to the trail. When I finally made it home, I collapsed on my bed, exhausted and terrified. I wanted to forget everything that had happened, to pretend it was just a nightmare. But when I checked my camera, the photos were still there. The eyes, the faces, the tree, it was all real. And then I noticed something else. In the last photo I had taken, just before the tree split open, there was a figure standing in the background. It was barely visible, cloaked in shadow, but it was there. Watching. Waiting. I haven't been back to the woods since, but every night when I close my eyes, I see it. The tree, the faces, the eyes. They're still watching me, waiting for the moment when I finally give in and return. And I know, deep down, that I won't be able to resist much longer, because the tree is calling me, and one day I'm going to answer. I'm not sure why I agreed to take the job in the first place. I guess I just needed the extra cash. Cleaning chimneys isn't glamorous, but it's good, honest work, and I've never had any reason to complain about it. It was last autumn, just before the cold started creeping in, when I got the call. An old, run-down manor on the outskirts of town needed a sweep. The house had been empty for years. No one had lived there since the owner, some recluse no one really knew, passed away a decade ago. But it had recently been bought by someone. I didn't ask many questions, not my business, you know. The caretaker, an old man named Mr. Higgins, had arranged everything over the phone, sounding like he was half dead himself. When I arrived, the place looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in a while. The paint peeled off the walls, the windows were caked with grime, and the garden was just a wild tangle of weeds. But inside, it was worse. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air smelled like mildew and damp wood. Perfect setting for a haunted house, I thought to myself, half joking. Mr. Higgins showed me to the main chimney. "This one's the worst," he said, barely moving his lips. His voice was as creaky as the floorboards we were standing on. "Hasn't been cleaned since the old owner died. No one's touched it." I set up my tools and started working. As usual, I threaded the brush up into the flue, twisting and pushing it higher. But something was off. The brush felt lighter than normal, like it was being pulled upward by something. At first, I figured it was just my imagination, or maybe a strong draft. These old houses are full of weird air currents after all. But then, as I pulled the brush back down, I saw it. A faint red glow, flickering like a distant flame, deep inside the chimney. I stopped what I was doing and leaned in closer, squinting up the flue. The light wasn't from my tools, and it wasn't a reflection. It was something else entirely. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the red glow was still there. I could feel a cold shiver running down my spine. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me after being in the dark for so long. I shook it off and kept working. But the weirdness didn't stop there. As I pushed the brush back up, it got stuck halfway up the flue. I tugged on it, tried to twist it free, but it wouldn't budge, and then it started moving on its own. The brush shot upward, yanked right out of my hands, like something had grabbed hold of it. I staggered back, nearly falling over. That's when I heard the whisper. A faint, scratchy voice, like the wind trying to form words. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it definitely wasn't natural. I looked up the chimney again, and there it was, that red light, brighter this time, flickering like it was alive. Every instinct in my body told me to leave. But I'm not one to back down, so I grabbed a flashlight and shone it up the chimney. My heart pounded in my chest as the beam of light cut through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but soot and brick. But then I saw it, a shape, small and curled, lodged deep inside the flue. It looked almost like a body, wedged up there, crumpled and twisted in the most unnatural way. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The red glow grew stronger, pulsating like a heartbeat, and the whispers returned, louder now, but still impossible to understand. I scrambled to grab my tools, but as I reached for them, something cold wrapped around my wrist. It felt like a hand, small, bony, with fingers that dug into my skin. I yanked my arm free and backed away, heart racing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something small and dark creeping down the chimney, like a shadow unfurling. The red light behind it cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. The thing twisted and writhed, pulling itself out of the flue, and for a moment I could make out a face, pale, hollow-eyed, with a twisted grin that looked too wide for its skull. The whispers grew into a low, guttural growl, and the thing lunged at me. I bolted from the room, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran down the hallway, the old house groaning around me, doors creaking open on their own as I passed. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't human. Not anymore. I burst out of the front door and didn't stop running until I was well away from the manor. My van sat parked at the edge of the driveway, but I didn't even go back for it. I just kept running, all the way back into town, with the whispers still echoing in my ears. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face again. Pale, grinning, waiting. The next day, I went back to the manor, determined to collect my tools and my van. But when I arrived, something was wrong. The windows, which had been grimy and cracked the day before, were now boarded up from the inside. The front door was locked, and no one answered when I knocked. I called Mr. Higgins, but the number was disconnected. No one in town seemed to know where he'd gone, or who had bought the house in the first place. It was like the manor had swallowed them whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even as I stood on the empty road. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen, and when I looked back at the house, I could have sworn I saw that same faint, red light flickering in one of the upper windows. I never went back after that. Not for the van, not for the tools. Nothing in this world would get me near that place again. But the strange part, the dreams haven't stopped. Every night, I see that chimney, the red glow growing stronger, and the whispers, clearer now, calling my name. Sometimes I wonder if I'll wake up to find myself back in that house. Other times, I'm not sure if I've ever truly left. Then last night, the worst happened. I woke up to the sound of scraping, like something crawling up the walls. My bedroom window had a faint red glow coming from outside, flickering like a flame. My breath caught in my throat as I walked over to the window and peeked through the curtains. In the distance, far off in the woods, the chimney of the manor stood tall, the red light shining brighter than ever. And in the faint glow, I could make out the figure, that twisted, grinning thing, watching me from the edge of the forest. I slammed the curtains shut, but it was too late. I could hear it now, whispering, scratching, growing louder with every passing second. I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me. And when it does, I don't think there'll be any running this time. I'm afraid the red light will never let me go. The forge had always been a sacred place to me. It was where my father spent his life, bending steel and crafting tools and weapons for the townsfolk. After he passed, I inherited the blacksmith shop, and it was all I had. I spent long hours hammering at the anvil, watching the sparks fly like fireflies in the dead of night. It wasn't until I found the mold that things began to change. I was cleaning out the old storage room in the back, a place my father had told me to avoid. Too dangerous, he'd said, though I never understood why. The dust in there coated everything in a thick layer of neglect. That's when I spotted it, tucked away under a pile of scrap metal, a sword mold, unlike any I'd ever seen. It was old, very old, maybe even ancient. I should have thrown it away when I noticed the imperfection, a tiny crack along one side, barely noticeable. But something about it called to me. The more I stared at it, the more I felt like it was meant for me, like it had been waiting all these years for someone to find it. I couldn't resist. I had to try it. The first time I poured molten metal into the mold, something fell off. The metal didn't flow the way it should have, almost as if the mold was swallowing it up, like the crack was alive, feeding on it. But I didn't stop. When I broke the sword free from the mold, I was stunned. The blade was sharp, sharper than anything I'd ever made, and the edges, God, the edges, they glowed in the dim light of the forge, a faint, sickly green. I chalked it up to the heat or some impurity in the metal, but that didn't explain the weight of it. It was lighter than it should have been, almost like it wasn't there at all, yet when I ran my finger along the edge, it sliced through my skin effortlessly. I bandaged my hand, telling myself it was nothing, but I knew it wasn't. I hung the sword on the wall, away from the other blades, and went to bed, hoping to forget about it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sword. It was like it was whispering to me, calling me back to the forge. I tossed and turned for hours before finally giving in. When I stepped into the forge, the sword was glowing, brighter this time. I could have sworn it was pulsing, like a heartbeat. I reached for it without thinking, my hand drawn to the hilt as if it had a will of its own. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, I felt something cold crawl up my arm, a chill that sank into my bones. I should have let go. I should have dropped it right there, but I didn't. I couldn't. The next day, word spread through the town. People had seen the sword, seen the glow from the windows of my shop late at night. They were curious. They wanted to see it for themselves. So I showed them. And that was my first mistake. One by one, people came into my forge, asking to buy the sword, begging me to sell it to them. But I couldn't part with it. It was mine, and I told them as much. But they didn't give up. Soon the requests turned into demands, and then threats. One man, Tom, a local hunter, came into my shop with a bag full of gold coins and a sneer on his face. "Name your price," he said. "I'm not selling," I replied, feeling the weight of the sword in my hand. Tom's eyes flicked to the blade. "That sword doesn't belong to you," he hissed. "It's not yours to keep." I didn't understand how he knew, but there was something in his voice, something that told me this sword was far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I refused him again, and he left, but I could feel his eyes on me as he went. That night, the sword glowed brighter than ever, lighting up the entire forge. I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the pull of it. I found myself standing over the anvil, holding the sword, staring at its sharp, glowing edge. That's when I heard it, the voice. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, until I could understand every word. "Feed me," it said. "Feed me, and I will give you power." I dropped the sword, heart pounding. It clattered to the floor, but the voice didn't stop. It echoed in my head, relentless. "Feed me." The next morning, I tried to go about my business as usual. I hammered at the anvil, repaired horseshoes, made a few nails. But the sword, it wouldn't leave my mind. And then Tom came back. He barged into my shop, eyes wild, demanding the sword again. This time he wasn't alone. A few other townsfolk stood behind him, all of them with that same crazed look. I didn't know what came over me, but I reached for the sword. The moment my hand touched the hilt, a surge of cold energy rushed through me, stronger than before. Without thinking, I raised the blade. The world slowed. I swung. The sword moved faster than I thought possible, slicing through the air, through Tom. He didn't even scream. He just dropped, his blood pooling around him, staining the dirt floor of the forge. The others ran, their eyes wide with terror. But I wasn't afraid. No, I felt powerful, more alive than I'd have felt in my life. The sword pulsed in my hand, its glow flickering like a flame in the wind. The voice returned, louder now. "More. Feed me more." I looked down at Tom's body, at the blood seeping into the cracks of the floor, and I knew what I had to do. I didn't want to, but the sword, it demanded it. Over the next few days, people started to disappear. First, it was the beggars, the ones no one would miss. Then it was the drunks, the troublemakers. Every night, I fed the sword, and every night, it grew stronger. The glow became a blinding light, and the voice, it consumed my thoughts. I couldn't escape it, couldn't resist it. I didn't even try. The town began to notice. They'd whispered about the disappearances, about the strange glow coming from my forge late at night. But no one dared confront me. They were too afraid. I should have stopped, should have broken the sword, destroyed the mold. But I didn't. I couldn't. Then one night, the voice told me something new. "You are not enough." I froze. The sword hummed in my hand, its glow flickering like a dying flame. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "More," it said, its voice cold and commanding. "The town. Feed me the town." I stared at the blade, horrified. I had already gone too far, done things I could never take back. But this was madness. I tried to resist, but the sword, it had control now. I was just a vessel, a puppet on its strings. That night, the sky over the town darkened. Clouds rolled in, black and heavy, blocking out the moon and stars. I stood in the center of the street, sword in hand, and called them to me. The townsfolk came, drawn by the blade's unnatural glow. They gathered around me, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. And then I began. The sword moved on its own, cutting through flesh and bone like butter. I swung again and again, and the screams filled the air. Blood splattered the ground, the walls, the windows. The sword drank it all. its light growing brighter with each life it took. By the time the sun rose, the town was silent. Bodies littered the streets, and the sword, it shone like a beacon, its glow so bright it hurt to look at. The voice was gone, but the damage was done. I stood alone in the empty town, the sword heavy in my hand, its sharp, glowing edges reflecting the carnage around me. I don't know what happens now. Maybe the sword will demand more. Maybe it will devour me next. Or maybe I'll take it to another town, start over, feed it again. All I know is that the mold, it's still in my forge, waiting for the next blade to be made, waiting for the next soul to fall under its spell, and I'm afraid I'll never be free. It started as a simple hobby, something to pass the cold, dark hours of the winter months. I had always been drawn to the snow, how it felt when it first fell, soft and pure, untouched. I'd spend hours in the backyard of my small cabin, carving out shapes, animals, and figures of people, nothing professional, just for fun. But last winter, something changed. My hands seemed to have taken on a life of their own. The sculptures became more intricate, more lifelike, without me putting in any extra effort. It was almost like the snow was shaping itself. At first, I was proud of my work, impressed that my little hobby had developed into something so detailed. But then things started to get strange. The first odd thing I noticed was the faces. I would plan out simple expressions, smiling, frowning, neutral. But every time I stepped back from my work, the expressions looked different from what I'd intended. More subtle, more complicated. Instead of the blank smiles I had aimed for, the faces would have a slight smirk, or the eyes would seem more narrowed, like the figure was suspicious or angry. The changes were always slight enough that I could brush them off at first. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But it wasn't just the faces. The details in the features themselves were off too. I'd carve out a rounded nose, and somehow, by the time I was done, it looked sharper, more angular. The cheeks would seem more sunken, and the lips thinner. No matter how hard I tried to stick to my original design, the figures always came out looking a little too real, a little too human. One night, while I was working on a snowman in front of my cabin, I decided to test it. I carefully carved out a face with wide eyes, a button nose, and a goofy grin. I took a step back, admiring my work. It was a harmless, silly snowman, just like the ones I used to make as a kid. But when I turned around for a second, just to grab a drink, I swear I heard something behind me. Like a soft crunch, snow being compressed. I spun back, heart pounding. The snowman stood there, still and innocent. But the grin I had given it was gone. In its place was a small smirk, subtle but unmistakable. The eyes, once wide and playful, now seemed to stare at me, calculating. I laughed it off, nervous but still laughing. Maybe I had just misremembered how I'd shaped the face. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the snowman. It was ridiculous, of course. Just a figure made of snow, no different from the dozens I'd made before, but something about it gnawed at me. The next morning, I found the snowman just where I had left it, except it had changed again. The smirk was deeper now, almost like a sneer. The eyes were narrower, almost accusatory, and the snow around its base was disturbed, as if something had shifted its position slightly. I could feel the unease creeping up my spine, but I forced myself to ignore it. Determined to shake the feeling, I went back to work. I started on a new figure, a larger one. I wanted to distract myself, to prove that I was still in control. But no matter how carefully I worked, how deliberately I shaped the face, it would always change. The nose would thin out, the cheeks would hollow, and the eyes, they became the worst part. The eyes in my sculptures no longer looked like simple dots pressed into the snow. They looked like they were watching me. By the time I finished the figure, it was night. I was exhausted, more mentally than physically. As I stood back to examine my work, my breath caught in my throat. The figure, once a simple faceless outline, now had a fully realized, disturbingly human face. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I circled around it. The lips, once smooth and featureless, now curved into a faint, knowing smile. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal, wasn't possible. I reached out to touch the face, hoping to smooth out the features, but the snow felt different, colder, harder. The face was set, solid, as if it had always been that way. I stumbled back inside my cabin, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the paranoia, convincing myself that I was just tired, that the long nights alone were messing with my head. But the unease wouldn't go away. The next morning, I found that the snowman I had built earlier was gone. Completely. There was no trace of it. Just an empty patch of disturbed snow where it had stood. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I was terrified. The larger figure was still there, standing tall, its human-like face now more pronounced than ever. I couldn't bring myself to approach it. Instead, I spent the day inside, avoiding the windows, trying to distract myself. But when night fell, I couldn't ignore it anymore. From the corner of my eye, I kept seeing movement outside. Just subtle shifts like shadows creeping across the snow. Every time I looked directly, there was nothing. But I could feel it. Something was out there watching me. I grabbed a flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped outside. The large figure was still there, but it had moved. It was closer to the house now, the snow around its base disturbed, as if it had dragged itself forward. Its eyes, those cold, unnatural eyes, were locked onto me, and the smile on its face had widened. I was done. I didn't care about my hobby, about the snow or the sculptures. I just wanted it gone. I grabbed a shovel and marched toward the figure, ready to tear it down, to erase whatever nightmare I had created. But as I raised the shovel, something stopped me. The air around the figure felt wrong. Too cold, too still. And before I could swing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The figure's hand. It was no longer a vague lump of snow. It was fully formed, fingers outstretched, reaching toward me. I stumbled back, dropping the shovel. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt oppressive, suffocating. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked every window, every door. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. The night dragged on, the minutes feeling like hours. I kept expecting to hear something. A knock on the door, the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. But it was silent. The kind of silence that feels alive, like it's hiding something. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with faces, snowy, cold, and too human. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things as quickly as I could, throwing my gear into my truck. As I loaded the last bag, I glanced over at where the figure had been. It was gone. The snow where it had stood was undisturbed, as if it had never been there in the first place. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure if I should feel relieved or more terrified. But I didn't have time to think. I got into my truck and sped down the snowy road, not looking back. But even as I left the cabin behind, the unease followed me. Every time I stopped for gas or a break, I felt it, that same sensation of being watched. And then, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing by the side of the road. Just a glimpse, but enough to recognize the unnaturally human face, the eyes locked onto me. It was closer than ever, almost like it had followed me. I kept driving faster, not daring to stop again. But no matter how far I went, I knew it was still there. Somewhere, waiting for me to look back. And when I finally do, I know it'll be smiling. I've been coaching football for nearly a decade, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on and off the field. But nothing prepared me for what happened last season. I almost don't want to talk about it. Some things are better left buried, you know. But I suppose you should hear it. Maybe you'll understand better than I ever could. It all started when our regular practice field got torn up in a storm. Lightning struck one of the goalposts, and the turf got completely flooded. We had nowhere to train for the upcoming season, and I was getting desperate. That's when one of the parents mentioned an old field just outside of town. I had never heard of it before, but they insisted it was perfect. Said they used to play there as kids, though it had been abandoned for years. They said it had been forgotten, which felt odd at the time, but I was too focused on finding a solution to think much about it. When I first went to check it out, I noticed something strange right away, the grass. Or rather, the lack of it. The entire field was just packed dirt, hard and cracked, with a few patches of weeds here and there. It looked like no one had taken care of it for decades. No big deal, though. I figured I could have the guys bring some turf shoes and work with it. The thing that struck me, though, was how quiet the place was. No birds, no crickets, just dead silence. and it wasn't like we were in the middle of nowhere. It was right on the edge of town, surrounded by trees. But standing there, all I could hear was the wind rustling the branches, nothing else. Still, I shrugged it off. It was a place to practice, and we were running out of time. We started using the field the next day. The kids didn't seem too thrilled with the dirt, but they weren't exactly complaining either. It wasn't until after the first practice that one of them, Marcus, pulled me aside. "Coach, my legs, they hurt, like bad," he said, rubbing his thighs. "Like a cramp, but deeper." I just chalked it up to the harbor surface. "You're not used to running on dirt, Marcus. You'll toughen up. Stretch more before practice, all right?" He nodded, but I could tell something wasn't sitting right with him. Marcus wasn't the type to whine, and that's what made me pause. But again, I figured it was just the surface. The next few days, things got worse. More kids started complaining, not just about sore muscles, but about this odd, throbbing pain that seemed to settle deep in their bones. At first, I thought it might be shin splints or something from the hard ground, but the pain didn't make sense. It wasn't focused in their joints or anything, it was just everywhere. Then it got weirder. One afternoon, during scrimmage, Marcus suddenly collapsed. No tackle, no hit, he just dropped. We rushed over to him, and he was pale, sweating like crazy. He kept saying his legs were burning, but when we checked, his skin was cold, almost icy to the touch. We got him to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. They pumped him full of fluids and sent him home, but the pain never went away. After that, Marcus stopped showing up to practice. And he wasn't the only one. One by one, the players began dropping out. First, it was soreness. Then it became full-blown agony, like someone was twisting their bones from the inside. They'd all described the same thing, this sharp, gnawing pain that started in their legs and spread up their bodies as if something was creeping through their veins. But what could I do? We had to keep practicing, and there was nowhere else to go. So the rest of the team stuck it out. At least, they tried to. One evening, after practice, I was the last one packing up. The sun was setting, and the sky had that deep orange glow. I remember walking toward the goalposts to gather up the last of the gear when I felt it, a chill, not from the air, but from the ground. It was like the dirt was vibrating under my feet, this low hum that made my stomach turn. Then I saw it. In the middle of the field, right where the kids had been running drills all week, the dirt was shifting, almost pulsating. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no. The ground itself was moving, like something underneath was pushing up, trying to break free. I stood frozen, just staring, when I heard a voice behind me. "Coach?" It was Marcus. He looked terrible, pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken in like he hadn't slept in days. His legs were shaking, barely holding him up. I can't take it anymore," he muttered, clutching his thighs. "It won't stop." "What are you talking about?" I asked, moving toward him. "The field. It's alive. It's inside us. I feel it crawling." Before I could respond, Marcus let out a scream and dropped to the ground, writhing in pain. I rushed to him, but as soon as I touched his arm, I felt it too. A low, throbbing ache spreading through my hand and up my arm. Panicked, I stepped back, but the pain didn't leave. It settled deep in my bones, cold and sharp, like something was burrowing into me. Marcus lay still, barely breathing. I don't remember how I made it home that night, but the pain followed me. It's still there even now as I tell you this. The field, whatever it is, took something from us, something none of us can explain. It wasn't just the dirt or the lack of grass. There was something underneath, something old and angry. I did some digging, literally, and found out that the field used to be a graveyard. Not just any graveyard, though. It was a mass burial site used during some outbreak over a century ago. They buried the dead in shallow graves, and as the years passed, the town forgot about it. The ground never forgot, though. The field fed on us, drawing something out from the kids, from Marcus, from me, and every time we set foot there, we woke it up, bit by bit. I quit coaching after that season. Most of the kids moved on, except for Marcus. He's in a wheelchair now, his legs completely numb. The doctors say it's nerve damage, but I know better. I still drive by that field sometimes, though I keep my distance. The dirt is still bare, just as cracked and dry as the day we first set foot on it. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear it hum, like it's waiting for someone else to feed it. I've been making maps for over a decade. It's a quiet life, mostly tucked away in my small office with a sketch pad, a ruler, and the endless hum of a scanner in the background. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Plus, I've always loved the detail work, the precision of creating something that guides others through places I may never go myself. But if I'd known where one particular map would lead me, I'd have quit the job years ago. It started with a job offer from a small, obscure publishing company, Mountain Law Publishing. I had never heard of them, but they contacted me about creating a map for an upcoming book, some kind of historical travelogue of lost places. They wanted the maps to be detailed and realistic, especially for a chapter on a mountain range called the Black Spire Peaks. I didn't recognize the name, but I figured it was just another forgotten set of hills somewhere. They sent me an old, tattered sketch as a reference. It was clearly ancient, hand-drawn in faded ink, the lines crooked and shaky. At first glance, I could see why they needed someone to clean it up. But something about it made me uneasy right away. It wasn't just the age of the map, it was the way the mountain range looked. The peaks were unnaturally sharp, jagged like broken glass. They didn't follow the natural flow of any geography I'd ever seen. Still, a job is a job. I set to work on recreating the drawing, using my usual tools to bring it to life digitally. But something odd happened. Every time I tried to copy the lines of the mountain range, they seemed to shift. Not by much, just small, almost imperceptible movements. A peak would bend slightly to the left, or a ridge would curve in a way that it hadn't before. I thought maybe my hand was slipping, or maybe the software was glitching, so I deleted it and started again. The same thing happened. The lines shifted. Frustrated, I tried to trace the original by hand. I printed out the sketch, laid it over my lightbox, and carefully traced every crooked line. But when I pulled the paper away, it wasn't the same. The peaks had shifted again, barely noticeable unless you looked closely. The shape of the range was different. And it wasn't just that they'd moved. The mountains looked taller, sharper. And every time they shifted, they seemed to grow more threatening, more unnatural. It was like the map didn't want to be copied. I called the company to ask about the reference, but they didn't pick up. No email responses either. I even looked up their address, thinking I might just mail the work and call it a day. But when I searched for them, there was nothing. No website, no phone listing, no trace of Mountain Law Publishing at all. It was as if they'd never existed. At this point, I should have just stopped. But something about the map, it fascinated me. I couldn't let it go. I told myself I just wanted to get it right. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Some pull I couldn't explain. One night, I stayed late in the office, determined to finish the map. I brought up the latest version on my screen, the peaks more jagged and unnerving than ever. The lines seemed to pulse as I stared at them, the ridges twitching almost imperceptibly. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was tired. But when I looked back, the lines were different again, subtly, but enough to make my stomach twist. Then the screen flickered, just for a second, but enough to make me jump. When it settled, the map had changed. The mountain range was there, but it was no longer a flat, 2D drawing. It had depth, like I was looking at a live feed from a drone flying over the range. The peaks seemed to stretch out toward me, shadows lengthening in the valleys between them. And then I saw movement. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe some glitch in the software. But no. There was something moving in the valleys, tiny black shapes, crawling across the jagged terrain like ants. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath shallow, trying to make out what they were. Figures. Human figures, or something close to it. They were thin, unnaturally so, and they moved in jerky, unnatural motions. Some of them crawled on all fours, while others seemed to stumble upright, dragging themselves across the ground. I could see their twisted limbs, their hollow eyes. And they were heading toward something. At the base of one of the larger peaks was an opening, a cave or tunnel of some kind. The figures swarmed toward it, vanishing into the darkness one by one. I felt cold sweat running down my back. I knew, deep down, that what I was seeing wasn't possible. But there it was, right in front of me. Suddenly, my computer crashed. The screen went black, and the whole room was plunged into darkness. I sat there frozen, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The silence was suffocating. Then I heard a noise. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, a low, droning hum, like wind passing through a narrow canyon. But there was no wind, not inside my office. I glanced at the window, but it was shut tight. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it became a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through the walls. I stood up, backing away from the desk. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the air around me, pressing down like something unseen was watching. The hum turned into a series of low, guttural whispers, like 100 voices speaking all at once, none of them making sense. Then I saw it. The map, still open on my desk, was glowing faintly. The lines of the mountain range shimmered in the darkness, and as I watched, they began to shift again, this time more dramatically. The peaks twisted and bent, spiraling into unnatural shapes, and from the center of the range, the cave appeared once more, the dark opening now impossibly wide. Something moved inside the cave. I could see it, a massive, shadowy figure, its outline barely visible against the blackness. It was too large, too impossible to be real. But it was there, and it was coming closer. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the air around me vibrating with every word, even though I still couldn't understand them. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, as the thing emerged from the cave. It was a shape, not fully formed, like smoke swirling into a vaguely humanoid figure. And it was staring right at me. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because when I woke up, it was morning. My office was a wreck, papers scattered everywhere, my computer fried. But the map was gone. I don't know how it disappeared or where it went, but I can still see those mountains in my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. They come through the walls, through the air, faint but growing louder every day. I've tried to forget it, but I know now that some things aren't meant to be mapped. Some places, once seen, stay with you forever. And I have a feeling the black spire peaks are waiting for me, waiting for the day I slip just for a moment and let myself be drawn back in. I've been sculpting marble for over 15 years. You'd think that after all this time, it'd be second nature, but each block is its own challenge. Every piece of marble has a soul of its own, or at least that's what I've always told myself to justify the strange feeling I get when I work. Some people see an untouched block and only notice its weight and hardness, but to me, it's like it's waiting for something to be uncovered, something trapped inside. It started 3 months ago when I received a commission for a life-sized statue of a woman. Nothing unusual there. I've done countless human figures before, some for wealthy clients, others for art galleries, but this one was different. The block arrived on a foggy morning, and the second I saw it, I felt uneasy. It was massive, more than what I needed, really, but the client insisted on getting a larger block. The thing that struck me the most wasn't its size, though, it was the tone. When I tapped it lightly with the edge of my chisel, the sound it made was low, almost hollow, like there was a cavern buried deep inside. I figured it was just some natural flaw in the stone, nothing I hadn't dealt with before. But the sound stayed with me, even when I wasn't working. Every time I chipped away, the tone would follow me, almost like it echoed longer than it should have. It wasn't just an ordinary resonance. No, this sound seemed to vibrate through the floor, creeping up into my bones. I'd hear it late at night, long after I put down my tools. At first, I thought it was just in my head. I work alone after all, and maybe I was just getting too wrapped up in the piece. As the days passed, things started getting strange. The sound wasn't the only thing off about the marble. When I worked on the figure's face, chipping away at the delicate features, I swear the stone felt warm. It was impossible, of course, but the tools would heat up faster, and I'd have to stop to let them cool down. I've worked with marble from all over the world, but I've never seen anything like this. Then there were the voices. At first, I thought it was just the echo of the hollow sound playing tricks on me. But soon, the murmurs became clearer, like whispers drifting up from the depths of the stone. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, but unmistakable. I couldn't make out any words, just the hushed tone, like someone was having a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I ignored it, tried to focus on the sculpture, but it was getting harder to push the noise aside. The figure started coming together though, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was impressed. The face was turning out better than I'd planned, the body almost perfect, but there was something off about it too. I couldn't quite put my finger on it until one night when I stayed late, determined to finish the piece. The studio was quiet except for the scraping of my tools against the marble, but every now and then I'd stop to catch my breath and listen. The low, hollow sound still echoed, but it was mixed with something else, something rhythmic. Breathing. I froze, chisel in hand, listening harder. It wasn't my breath. It wasn't coming from me at all. It was coming from the sculpture. I backed away slowly, the chisel clattering to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, and the studio felt colder than usual. I approached the statue again, cautiously this time, and ran my hand over the smooth stone. It was cool to the touch, just like any marble should be, but the breathing didn't stop. It grew louder the closer I got. I told myself I was just imagining things. Lack of sleep, too much time spent working alone. I needed to clear my head. So I took a few days off, left the studio untouched, and tried to shake the feeling of unease. But the whispers, they'd followed me. No matter where I went, I could hear them, soft, just below the surface of every noise around me. At night, they were louder, as though the stone was calling to me. Against my better judgment, I returned to the studio after those days off. I couldn't leave the piece unfinished. The client was expecting it, and besides, I'd never walked away from a project before. When I entered the studio, I was greeted by an overwhelming sense of dread. The statue was standing in the center of the room, where I'd left it, but something was wrong. It looked more detailed, more human than I remembered. The veins in the hands, the supple curve of the lips. They were too real. The breathing was louder now, constant, like it had been waiting for me to return. I circled the statue, studying it from every angle, but something about the face caught my eye. I moved closer, squinting at the figure's eyes. They were open. No, that couldn't be right. The eyes were supposed to be closed. I hadn't even finished detailing them. But there they were, staring back at me, cold and glassy, like real eyes frozen in stone. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my tools, but I couldn't look away. I don't know what possessed me, but I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the face. It was no longer cool to the touch. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly beneath my hand like a heartbeat. I jerked my hand back, horror flooding through me. The whispers rose to a crescendo, louder than ever, and this time I could make out the words. "Let me out." I ran. I don't even remember locking the studio behind me, but I must have. I didn't go back the next day, or the day after. I was too terrified to face whatever was inside that marble, but it didn't matter. The sound followed me, no matter where I went. The low, hollow tone echoed in my head, growing louder by the day. The whispers never left me either. They were always there, reminding me of the thing I'd left behind in the studio. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was inside that marble, something alive, and it wanted out. A week passed before I worked up the courage to go back. I had to finish it. Maybe if I completed the statue, the noises would stop. Maybe I could lock whatever it was back inside. But when I entered the studio, the statue wasn't where I'd left it. It had moved. Not far, just a few feet, but enough to make my blood run cold. The eyes were still open, still watching me, but now the lips had changed. They were parted slightly, almost like they were about to speak. The whispers started again, louder this time. "Let me out." I grabbed my tools, determined to end it, to smash the thing to pieces. But the second I raised the hammer, the statue moved. It was subtle, just a twitch, but enough to stop me in my tracks. I dropped the hammer, my heart pounding in my chest. The statue's mouth moved again, and this time it wasn't a whisper. "Thank you." The last thing I remember was the sound of cracking stone, the hollow tone echoing through the room. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in the studio anymore. I was inside the marble, trapped, unable to move, unable to scream. I can still hear the sound of the tools chipping away at me from the outside, the low, hollow tone filling the air. And the whispers, they're louder now, because they're coming from me. I found the pattern in a dusty corner of the old shop. It was tucked away in a stack of worn-out dress sketches, the kind you'd expect to find in a place like this. The shop had been my grandmother's, passed down through the family, and now it was mine. I'd been a seamstress for years, working mostly on repairs and the occasional custom piece. But that pattern, it was different. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a simple dress design, nothing out of the ordinary, yet something about it caught my eye. The lines were elegant, the cut was flattering, and it had this old-world charm that I hadn't seen in ages. I figured it would be a good project, something fresh to offer my clients. I started working on the dress late one night, after a long day of hemming jeans and sewing on buttons. As I cut the fabric, I noticed something strange. The pattern didn't quite match the sketch anymore. The waistline seemed narrower than I remembered, the neckline a little deeper. I chalked it up to my tired eyes, made a mental note to check it in the morning, and kept working. By the time I finished the first dress, it looked different from the sketch I'd found. But it was gorgeous, more so than anything I'd ever made. It was the kind of dress that practically begged to be worn. I hung it on a mannequin in the front of the shop and went to bed feeling satisfied. The next day, the first person who came in saw it and fell in love. "It's perfect," she said, running her hands over the fabric like it was silk. "I've never seen anything like it. How much?" I named a price, half expecting her to haggle, but she didn't. She paid upfront and left with the dress. I didn't think anything of it at first, but later that afternoon she came back. She looked different. Her face was flushed, her movements jittery, like she was too hot under the fabric. "It's too warm," she said, fanning herself. "I don't understand. It's not even that heavy, but the moment I put it on, I started sweating. Do you think you can fix it?" I took the dress back, promising to make adjustments, and once she was gone, I looked at it more closely. The fabric didn't seem thick or heavy, but when I ran my fingers over it, I noticed something. It felt warm. Not just the usual warmth from handling fabric, but like it had a life of its own. I brushed it off and decided to tweak the design. When I put the dress back together, the pattern had shifted again. The waist was even tighter this time, the hemline a bit shorter, but I couldn't bring myself to change it back. It looked too good. The customer picked it up the next day. She seemed hesitant but took the dress anyway. That night, I received a frantic phone call from her. "I can't breathe," she screamed. "It's too tight. I'm burning up." I told her to take it off, but the line went dead before she could answer. I never heard from her again. The next morning, her husband came by the shop. His eyes were hollow, his face pale. "She's dead," he said flatly. "Collapsed in the dress. The doctors said it was heat stroke, but it doesn't make sense. She was in an air-conditioned room." My heart sank, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I apologized, offered condolences, and promised to close the shop for the day, but once he left, I found myself staring at the pattern again. Something about it drew me back in. I couldn't leave it alone. Despite everything, I started making another dress. This time, I worked faster, my hands moving with a strange urgency I didn't understand. Each time I thought I had the pattern down, it would shift slightly, like it was alive, adjusting itself as I sewed. The neckline dipped lower than I intended, and the skirt clung tighter, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt right in a twisted sort of way. A new client came in a few days later, and she was immediately drawn to the second dress. Her eyes sparkled when she tried it on, but the same thing happened. Within minutes, she complained about feeling too warm, almost feverish. I should have stopped. I should have told her to take it off, that something wasn't right, but I didn't. I was in too deep. She left with the dress, and by the next morning, I heard the news. She was found unconscious in her apartment, soaked in sweat, her body unnaturally hot to the touch. It didn't make any sense, but it was happening again. I wanted to throw the pattern away, burn it, but every time I tried, something stopped me. My hands would shake, or I'd lose my nerve. I told myself I could fix it, make it better, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The final straw came when I made the third dress. This one felt different from the start. The fabric seemed to hum under my fingers, almost like it was breathing. The pattern shifted constantly, not just once or twice, but every time I looked at it. The lines blurred, twisted, and reformed into something else. And the more I worked on it, the more I felt possessed. I barely slept. I barely ate, I just sewed, my hands working as if they weren't mine anymore. When the dress was finished, I hung it up and stared at it for hours. It was beautiful, too beautiful. I could feel the heat radiating off it like it was alive, like it was feeding off something. The next customer who saw it didn't even hesitate. She bought it immediately, and as soon as she left the shop, I felt a crushing weight settle over me. I knew what was going to happen, but I couldn't stop it. I didn't want to stop it. She was found the next day, her body twisted and scorched, as if she'd been burned from the inside out. The police came by the shop, but they couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. I played dumb, pretending I didn't know why this kept happening. But I knew it was the pattern. It had taken on a life of its own, and it was feeding on the people who wore the dresses. I tried to stop making them, I really did, but the pull was too strong. I kept going back to that pattern, cutting fabric, sewing, watching as the design shifted and changed on its own. I'd convinced myself I wasn't responsible, that it wasn't me, it was the pattern, the fabric, the dress. But I knew better. Now I'm wearing one of the dresses. I made it for myself this time, knowing full well what it would do. As I sit here, I can feel the heat building under my skin, crawling up my spine, spreading through my veins. It's not just warmth, it's fire. My vision blurs, and I can feel my breath growing shallow. I know I won't survive this one. But the worst part, I don't care anymore. The pattern has won. It's taken everything from me, my life, my will, my sanity. And as the heat consumes me, all I can think about is how beautiful the next dress will be. I'm a bricklayer by trade. Been doing it for about 25 years now. It's a solid job, good money, and most days I can just zone out while I work. But there was this one job, just thinking about it now still makes my skin crawl. It started out like any other gig. A guy named Mr. Ratcliffe had bought an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was in terrible shape, falling apart at the seams. The man wanted a garden wall built, something sturdy to match the house's style. I agreed, took my measurements, ordered the bricks, and got to work. The bricks arrived a few days later. They looked normal enough at first. Good quality, sturdy, the kind that lasts for decades. But the moment I touched them, I felt odd. There was something off about their texture, like they were warm, even in the crisp autumn air. I brushed it off, figuring it was just my imagination. That's the thing about being out in the elements all day. Sometimes your senses get a little screwy. I laid the first row, nothing special. But by the time I got home that evening, I couldn't shake this feeling. It wasn't anything specific, just this vague unease, like something was hovering just behind me all day. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Kept seeing those bricks in my mind's eye, the way the sunlight hit them, and made them seem to shift in color just for a second. The next day, I went back to work. The bricks looked a little different though. The red hue had dulled slightly, almost as if they had aged overnight. Weird, but I figured it was just the light, or maybe some dust had settled on them. I kept laying row after row. But as I worked, I noticed that every time I looked away and back again, the bricks seemed darker, just a little, barely noticeable, but enough that it got under my skin. By the third day, I knew something was wrong. The bricks had gone from a dusty red to a deep, murky brown. There was no way this was normal. I ran my hand along them, expecting to feel some residue, something to explain the change, but they were smooth. Cold, this time. Not warm like they had been at first. I even asked the guy who delivered them if he'd noticed anything unusual, but he just shrugged, said they looked fine to him. I tried to shake it off again, told myself I was overthinking. But by the time I finished that day, the bricks were a dark, rusty color. They almost looked like dried blood. Still, I kept working. What was I supposed to do? Tell the client his wall was haunted? He'd laugh me out of town. So I kept my mouth shut. Things started getting worse though. On the fourth day, I could swear the bricks were changing while I watched. It was subtle at first. I'd lay a brick, step back to check my work, and when I looked back, the brick seemed darker than when I said it. By the fifth day, it was undeniable. They were almost black now, like charred wood. It wasn't just the color. The bricks seemed heavier too. I had to strain more to lift them, my muscles burning after just a few hours of work. The air around the wall felt thicker, like I was working under a weight I couldn't see. and that nagging sense of being watched. It had grown stronger. I'd glance over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was never anyone, just the empty yard. By the 6th day, I was seriously freaked out. The bricks were now fully black, absorbing the sunlight instead of reflecting it. The temperature around the wall had dropped, even though it was a mild day. I noticed my breath fogging in front of me as if I was standing in the dead of winter. That night, I had the worst dreams. I saw the wall towering above me, looming like a monolith. The bricks were oozing this thick, tar-like substance, and I was stuck there, my feet sunk into the ground, unable to move as the blackness spread toward me. I didn't want to go back the next day, but I had to finish the job. I'm not the type to leave something half done, no matter how creepy it gets. So I showed up, tools in hand, ready to get it over with. The final row of bricks was heavier than the others, almost unnaturally so. It took all my strength to lift them into place. By the time I set the last brick, I was drenched in sweat, my arms trembling from the effort. But when I stepped back to admire my work, I felt a deep, unsettling chill. The wall was pitch black now. Not just dark, but the kind of black that seemed to pull in all the light around it. The garden, once bright and airy, felt dim and oppressive, like the wall was sucking the life out of everything near it. And then, as I stood there staring, I heard it. A low, grinding noise, like stone scraping against stone. The wall, it was shifting. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but the bricks were moving, ever so slightly, as if something was pushing against them from the other side. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer. That's when I saw the cracks. Tiny fissures were spreading across the surface of the wall, spiderwebbing out from the center. Something dark was seeping through the cracks, slowly at first, then faster, like ink bleeding through paper. I backed away, my gut screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The blackness kept spreading, covering the wall like a living shadow. And then, in the center of it, I saw something. A face. No, not a face, just the impression of one, pressed against the bricks, stretching them from the inside. The features were distorted, the mouth wide open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my tools and ran, not even bothering to lock the gate behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. It felt like it was burned into my brain, like it was still watching me. The next day, I drove past the house, just to see if the wall was still standing. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I found. The house was gone. No, not just the house. The entire lot was empty, like it had never been there. The garden, the wall, everything gone. I pulled over and just stared at the empty field for what felt like hours. There was no sign of the house, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. I even called the client, Mr. Redcliffe, but the number was disconnected. It was like the whole job had never happened. But I know it did. I can still feel it, that cold chill in the air, that creeping sense of being watched. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see that wall. That black, endless wall with something trapped behind it waiting. I haven't touched a brick since. I was never one to believe in things I couldn't explain. As a horse trainer, I always relied on logic, technique, and discipline. But that was before I found the horse. It all started one cold afternoon when I was driving back from a small competition in a neighboring town. I was about to turn onto the highway when I saw it, standing alone by the side of the road. The horse was pure black, its coat shining even in the dimming light. There was no saddle, no halter, no owner in sight, just this horse, standing still as a statue watching me. I pulled over, thinking maybe someone had lost their animal, or worse, abandoned it. As I stepped out of the truck, the horse trotted right up to me. There was something about its eyes, something unsettling. They were too dark, almost like pits, swallowing all the light around them. I reached out, half expecting it to shy away, but it didn't. It stood still, calm. It didn't even flinch when I touched its neck. The coat was smooth, but there was a strange coldness to it, like it had been standing out in the frost for hours. No tags, no branding. I thought maybe I'd take it home for the night and try to find its owner the next day. So I led it to the trailer, and it stepped in without hesitation, like it knew where it was going. When we got back to my ranch, the horse unloaded itself from the trailer, still as calm as ever. I led it into one of the empty stalls and gave it some hay and water, but it just stood there staring at me like it didn't care about food or water. I figured maybe it was just nervous, so I left it alone for the night. That's when things started getting strange. The next morning, I came out to check on the horse. The hay was untouched, the water bowl still full. I'd seen nervous horses refuse to eat, but usually they give in after a while. Not this one. It just stood there, as still as it had been the night before. I decided to take it out for a ride, thinking maybe some exercise would shake off its nerves. I saddled it up and climbed on, and that's when I heard it, the sound of its hooves. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first, just the usual clop of hooves on the dirt. But after a few minutes, I noticed something strange. The sound didn't stop when the horse did. We'd come to a slow stop at the edge of the field, but the clop of hooves kept echoing in my ears, like some kind of lingering ghost sound. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was just hearing things, but then it happened again when we started moving. The hooves would strike the ground, and even when the horse paused, the echo would continue, hanging in the air, distant but sharp. I brushed it off. I had to be imagining things. But then, day after day, it got worse. The horse never ate. It never drank. I'd take it out for rides, and the hooves would echo longer each time, almost like the sound was chasing us. No matter how fast or slow we went, the echoes stayed. I mentioned it to a few friends in passing, but they just laughed, told me I was probably overworked or hearing things. But I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just some nervous horse. Something was off. One night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes, the way the horse stared at me every time I entered the barn. So I went out to the stall to check on it. The moon was bright that night, casting long shadows across the ranch. As I approached the barn, I heard something, hooves, faint but unmistakable, echoing out from inside. But the horse wasn't moving. It was standing there, still as ever, but the sound of its hooves filled the air louder and louder. It was like the whole barn was vibrating with it. I backed away, too unnerved to stay. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I decided to ride it again, this time to the far edge of the ranch where no one would hear or see us. I saddled up and took off, pushing the horse faster than I ever had. The hooves echoed, bouncing off the hills, louder and louder, until it felt like the ground itself was shaking beneath us. Then, something even worse happened. As we galloped across the field, I looked down and saw something that made my blood run cold. The horse's shadow, it wasn't right. It didn't match his body. The shadow was distorted, larger, more twisted, like it had extra legs or something crawling beneath it. And the echoes of the hooves. God, they were deafening by now, like they were pounding inside my head. I pulled back on the reins, trying to stop, but the horse wouldn't listen. It kept running faster and faster, like it was chasing something or being chased itself. My heart was pounding. The air around us felt thick, like I couldn't breathe. Finally, we stopped. The echoes lingered longer this time, and I swear, for a split second, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure, dark and shadowy, moving along with the sound of the hooves. But when I turned, it was gone. I didn't ride the horse again after that. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't sell it. Who would believe me? But I couldn't keep it either, not after what I'd seen. The last night it was at the ranch, I woke up to the sound of hooves again, louder than ever, echoing through the whole house. I rushed to the window and saw it, the horse, standing in the middle of the field, not moving, but the sound of its hooves filled the night. And there, next to it, was that figure again, only this time it was clearer, tall, dark, twisted, and staring right at me. I didn't go outside. I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, as the sound grew louder, filling my ears, pounding in my chest. By morning, the horse was gone. No sign of it anywhere. I searched the fields, the barn, everywhere, but it had vanished. And yet, the echoes of its hooves remained, faint but always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The clop of hooves, faint but unmistakable, like the horse is still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. I don't know what it was, where it came from, or what it wanted. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget those eyes, and the way they seemed to see straight through me. And the sound of those hooves. It still haunts me. I've been a shipbuilder for as long as I can remember. It's in my blood, passed down from my father and his father before him. Our family business isn't big, but it's steady. We've built everything from fishing boats to luxury yachts over the years. There's something almost meditative about working with wood and steel, about shaping something that's meant to ride the waves. But none of that prepared me for what I stumbled upon last winter. It was an unusually quiet season, with hardly any commissions coming in. I'd been clearing out an old storeroom in the back of the workshop when I found the plans. Tucked behind a dusty old cabinet, they were rolled up in a cracked leather tube that looked ancient. The paper was brittle, yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded, but it was still readable. The drawings were intricate, showing every detail of a boat that, as far as I could tell, had never been built. At first, I thought maybe it was a failed project from years ago, abandoned by my grandfather or some long-forgotten client. But the more I studied the plans, the more I realized that wasn't the case. The design was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The hull was wider than it should be, the bow pointed at an odd angle. There was something off about the dimensions, like they didn't quite fit together in the way boats normally did. It was almost as if the thing wasn't meant to float. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to copy the plans, just to see if I could make sense of them by redrawing everything. But as soon as I finished tracing the first page, something strange happened. Another page appeared. I'm not saying it just dropped out of nowhere, but when I turned the blueprint over, there was an extra sheet underneath that hadn't been there before. I could have sworn I'd checked the roll thoroughly before starting, and there'd only been one page. The new sheet showed a different part of the boat, something deeper, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a cutaway of the interior, showing rooms that didn't make sense for a vessel of that size. Hallways twisted in on themselves, staircases that seemed to go nowhere, and doors that led to empty spaces. The more I copied, the more pages appeared, each one more baffling than the last. At first, I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe there was something about the way the ink was fading that made it hard to notice. But I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just mistakes or oversights. It was like the plans weren't growing. I kept copying though, I don't know why. It was like I was being pulled into it, like there was something I had to uncover. The more I worked, the stranger things became. Every time I copied a page, I'd find a new one beneath it. It got to the point where I stopped questioning it. I'd start in the morning, trace the lines, measure the angles, and by the time I'd finish, there'd be another page waiting for me. It wasn't just the plans that were getting to me. Weird things started happening around the shop. Tools would go missing and turn up in places I hadn't left them. Lights would flicker when I was deep in thought, hunched over the plans late at night. And then there were the sounds, creaking, like the groan of old wood shifting in a storm, even though there wasn't a single breeze outside. One night, after hours of copying, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The last page I'd copied showed a diagram of the boat's hull, but there was something in the water beneath it, a shape, barely noticeable, like a shadow. At first, I thought it was just a smudge of ink, but as I looked closer, the shape seemed to move. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I swear it shifted when I wasn't looking directly at it. I dropped the pen and stepped back. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and my hands were shaking. It was late, too late, and I was exhausted. I decided to leave it for the night, but as I was packing up, I heard something. A low, hollow sound, like the distant tolling of a bell. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, echoing in the stillness of the shop. I thought maybe it was the wind, but when I stepped outside, the night was calm. No wind, no movement, just an eerie stillness. I went back inside, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to be coming from the plans themselves, from the paper. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I had other work to do, real work, but I couldn't shake the urge to go back to the plans. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed to figure out what was going on. I sat down at the workbench and unrolled the blueprints. There were dozens of pages now, far more than there had been at the start. They were scattered across the table, a sprawling, confusing maze of lines and measurements. I picked up the pen again. The sound started as soon as I began to trace the next page. That low, hollow tone, like something resonating deep within the paper. It was louder this time, more insistent. My hands shook as I tried to steady the ruler, but the lines wouldn't stay straight. The more I drew, the worse it got. The sound grew louder, almost deafening, and then something snapped. I looked down at the plans, and the lines I'd been tracing weren't lines anymore. They were ropes, twisting and knotting themselves into shapes I couldn't make sense of. The boat, the one I'd been copying so carefully, was gone. In its place was something else, something dark, something alive. It writhed on the paper, pulsing and shifting like it was trying to break free. I threw the pen down and stepped back, but it didn't stop. The pages were moving now, the lines twisting and turning on their own. And then I saw it. In the center of the diagram, where the boat's hull should have been, there was a shape. A figure. It was small at first, barely more than a shadow, but it grew as I watched. It was a person. No, not just a person, it was me. I don't know how to explain it. It was like looking into a mirror, but the reflection wasn't right. The figure on the page looked like me, but it was twisted, distorted. Its limbs were too long, its eyes too dark, and it was staring back at me. I grabbed the plans and shoved them into the tube, throwing it across the room, but the sound didn't stop. That low, hollow tone was still there, echoing in my ears, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I tried to leave the shop, but the door wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath me began to tilt, like I was standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of a storm. And then I realized I was. The shop wasn't the shop anymore. The walls were gone, replaced by the creaking wood of a boat's hull. The air was thick with the smell of salt and brine, and the floor rocked beneath my feet. I stumbled toward the door, but there was no door, just a narrow hallway that twisted and turned like the plans I'd been copying. I was on the boat, the one I'd been drawing, the one that wasn't supposed to exist, and I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing at the end of the hall, watching me with those dark, empty eyes. I never should have copied those plans. Now I can't escape them. I'm trapped in the boat that was never built, and I don't know if I'll ever find my way out. I've been a baker my whole life. There's something about the process, turning simple ingredients into something people enjoy, that's always been satisfying. My shop, Rosemary's Rise, has been around for a good decade, and in our small town, it's the go-to for fresh bread. Everything was fine until last week. That's when I found the recipe. It started with a box. Some deliveries came in from a bulk order, flour, sugar, the usual stuff, but this one box didn't have a label. I figured it was a mix-up, but curiosity got the better of me, so I opened it. Inside was an old, tattered notebook. The pages were yellowed and brittle like it had seen better days. At first, I thought it might be an antique recipe book. Flipping through, I found handwritten notes in some language I couldn't recognize, except for one page. Dark hearth bread, it said at the top, written in neat cursive. Underneath were instructions in English, but the ingredients? I'd never heard of any of them. Things like stoneflower extract and ashen marrow. What the hell is ashen marrow? The measurements were weird too, calling for a pinch of twilight and 3 drops of half embers. Of course I thought it was a joke. Maybe some old-timey prank or a forgotten Halloween gimmick. But there was something about it, the way it was written, that pulled me in. It felt wrong, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I did what any baker would do. I tried to replicate it. I figured I'd just substitute the weird ingredients with what I had. Stoneflower extract became lavender oil, ashen marrow turned into regular marrow from the butcher. The measurements? I did my best to guess. The first batch came out strange. The bread, as soon as I pulled it from the oven, was black. Not burnt, just black. It smelled like smoke and tasted worse, like I'd bitten into a lump of cold ash. I spat it out immediately and tossed the rest into the garbage. I thought that was the end of it. But the next day, the thought of that bread gnawed at me. I've never failed at baking so badly. I told myself it was just a bad substitution, and maybe if I tweaked it a bit, it would come out better. So I tried again, using slightly different ingredients. Same result. Black as night. Tasting of ash. This time, though, I noticed something else. The recipe had changed. Where it once said stoneflower extract, now it said harvested under the cold moon. The words ashen marrow now read extracted from the bones of the forgotten. I could swear that wasn't how it looked before. The paper seemed fresher too. The brittle, crumbling pages now felt almost new, and the ink had deepened. Despite how uneasy I felt, I tried again. It became an obsession. Every morning I would wake up, look at the recipe, and see new details emerging on the page, more specific, more disturbing. A pinch of twilight became collected in the hour of death. I tried to ignore it, but each time I substituted ingredients, the bread got blacker, the taste more unbearable, like eating a mouthful of burnt matches. And the smell, it lingered. No matter how much I cleaned, it stayed in the kitchen, that sharp, acrid stench. Then came the whispers. It started late one night while I was prepping dough for a new batch. I heard something just on the edge of my hearing, like someone murmuring in the back room. But I was alone. I paused, thinking maybe the radio was on. It wasn't. The whispering was coming from the recipe book. I stood there, staring at it, heart pounding. The pages were fluttering on their own, like something invisible was flipping through them. I wanted to close it, throw it out, burn it, anything to get rid of the damn thing, but my hands wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself turning to the page with the dark hearth bread. The letters were glowing now, faintly, like embers in a dying fire. The words had shifted again. This time, the ingredients were clearer than ever. The blood of the willing and the marrow of a lost soul. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. The next morning, I went to the butcher for marrow, and I swear the guy gave me a weird look when I asked for something specific, marrow from a cow that died recently. The fresher, the better, I'd said, not even knowing why. I mixed the ingredients, my hands moving automatically, like I was on autopilot. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. As I kneaded the dough, it felt wrong, too warm, too pliable, almost like it was alive. I put it in the oven, and the moment the heat hit, the whispering came back. Only now, it wasn't just a murmur. It was a voice, clear and soft, calling my name. "Come closer," it said. "You're almost there." I backed away, heart racing, sweat dripping down my back. The oven door rattled, like something inside was trying to get out. The smell of burning ash filled the room, stronger than ever before. And then the door burst open. The loaf that fell onto the floor wasn't bread. It was a charred, twisted shape, something almost human. Its blackened fingers twitched, and a face, barely formed from the dough, turned toward me. Eyes made of burnt crust blinked, and a mouth opened in a soundless scream. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. I grabbed the recipe book and threw it into the oven, slamming the door shut, hoping the fire would destroy it. But as the flames licked at the pages, the screaming started. Not from the book, but from inside the bread. That thing, whatever it was writhing, twisting on the floor, and the more I watched, the more it began to look like me. I ran out of the shop. I don't know how long I was gone, but when I came back, the place was silent. The recipe book was gone, vanished without a trace, and the oven was cold. There was no sign of the twisted bread creature, no smell of ash. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all. But then I saw the flour on the counter, still shaped like handprints, and the oven, inside, something had been carved into the metal, deep enough that it would never come out. We are one. I haven't baked since. I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see that thing, feel its doughy fingers reaching for me. Sometimes at night, I still hear the whispering. I've checked the kitchen more times than I can count, but the book hasn't returned. Yet. But deep down, I know it's not gone. One of these days, I'll wake up, and it'll be there waiting for me to finish the recipe. And when I do, I won't be the one eating the bread. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe I think putting the words on paper will make it easier to believe what happened. Or maybe I'm just hoping someone will understand. Either way, this is the last thing I'll ever write. It started a few months ago. I'm a singer, or at least I used to be before all this. I wasn't famous, but I had my regulars, bars, clubs, the occasional wedding. It was enough to keep me going, enough to pay the bills and keep me busy. My life was simple, ordinary, even boring at times. Then I found the song. I had a routine. Rehearse in the mornings, perform at night, repeat. On one of those slow mornings, I was looking for something new to add to my set list. Something different, you know? That's when I found it. I can't even remember where. Maybe it was in an old book of sheet music or a file I'd downloaded ages ago. The song didn't have a name, just a series of notes and lyrics that seemed strange. The melody was haunting, beautiful in a way that gave me chills. The lyrics didn't make much sense, just vague, poetic nonsense about shadows and silence, the kind of cryptic stuff that seemed cool but had no real meaning. But something about it pulled me in. I started practicing it, singing it over and over until I knew it by heart. That's when I noticed something odd. The first time I sang it all the way through, I swear the last note hung in the air for a second too long. I thought maybe it was just the acoustics of my room, or maybe my imagination. But the more I sang it, the longer the notes lingered. They didn't fade away like they should have. Instead, they stretched out like they were stuck in the air, refusing to let go. At first, it was kind of cool. I figured it was just a weird quirk of the song, something that made it unique. But then it got worse, much worse. One night, after practicing for hours, I sang the last note, and it didn't stop. I stood there, staring at the walls of my small apartment, and the sound just kept going. It wasn't just a note anymore, it was like the air around me was vibrating, humming with this low, resonant tone. I clapped my hands, stomped my feet, did everything I could think of to break the sound, but nothing worked. It just stayed there, filling the room. I didn't sleep that night. The sound didn't stop, not until the sun came up. And even then, I could still hear it, faint but persistent, like an echo buried deep in my ears. I tried to ignore it, to go on with my day, but it was always there, just on the edge of my hearing, like a buzzing I couldn't shake. I told myself it was all in my head. I hadn't been sleeping well, probably stressed out. But the next time I sang the song, the same thing happened. And this time, the sound didn't just linger in the room, it followed me. Everywhere I went, I could hear the song or pieces of it. I'd be walking down the street and suddenly, I'd catch a few notes, like they were being carried on the wind. In the shower, in the car, even in the middle of conversations, I'd hear it, always there, just beneath the surface. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. I stopped singing after that. It was the only word I could think to make it stop. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. The notes grew louder, sharper, until they weren't just sounds anymore. They felt like they were cutting through me, vibrating in my bones, rattling in my chest. I'd lie in bed, clutching my head, trying to block it out, but it didn't matter. The song was everywhere, inside me, outside me. It had become a part of me. I tried everything to make it stop. I went to doctors, audiologists, even a therapist. They'd all told me the same thing. It was stress, anxiety, maybe even a form of tinnitus. No one believed me when I told them it wasn't in my head, that the notes were real, that I could hear them, feel them. They gave me pills, told me to rest, and sent me on my way. But the song didn't stop. By this point, I'd lost all interest in singing. I couldn't even bear to listen to music anymore. Every time I tried, the notes would weave their way into whatever song I was listening to, distorting it, twisting it until it wasn't music anymore. It was just noise, this endless droning noise that filled my head and wouldn't leave me alone. The worst part was that no one else could hear it. I'd ask my friends, my neighbors, even strangers on the street if they heard anything, but they always looked at me like I was crazy. And maybe I was. Maybe I still am. The final straw came last week. I hadn't sung the song in months, but I couldn't take it anymore. The constant hum, the vibrating tones, the way it felt like the air itself was heavy with sound. I had to get rid of it. So I sang the song again, hoping that maybe if I finished it, the song would end and the noise would stop. But it didn't. I sang every note, every word, and when I reached the end, the sound that followed was unbearable. It wasn't just in the room this time, it was in my head, in my chest, vibrating through me like I was the instrument, not my voice. The walls shook, the windows rattled, and I could feel my bones humming with the song's resonance. And then, for the first time, I heard something else. Not just the notes, but a voice. A low, whispering voice that sang along with me, echoing the words, twisting them into something darker, something I couldn't understand. I tried to stop, but I couldn't. My mouth kept moving, my throat kept producing the notes, even as I felt my mind slipping away, drowning in the endless hum. The voice grew louder, overpowering me, filling the room until there was nothing left but the sound, the song, and the voice. Now the song never stops. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can barely think. The voice is always there, whispering, singing, drawing me deeper into its melody. It wants me to keep singing, to finish what I started, but I know that if I do, I won't come back. I'll be lost in the song, just another note in its endless melody. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. The song is getting louder, stronger, and the voice is almost too much to bear. I can feel it pulling me in, dragging me down into its dark, resonant depths, and I know that once I go, there won't be any coming back. So, if you ever find a song that doesn't have an end, don't sing it. No matter how beautiful it sounds, no matter how much it calls to you, don't sing it, because once you start, you'll never stop. You ever have something you just can't explain? It happened to me last winter when I found that piece of wood. I still think about it even now. I remember every little detail. It was just a normal day, cold, the kind that makes your breath cloud in the air like smoke. I had my woodshop running like usual, and the sound of chisels tapping and sawdust flying was comforting. Wood carving is what I do to clear my head. There's something satisfying about taking something plain and giving it shape. But then I found that wood. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was low on materials, so I decided to stop by the old lumberyard at the edge of town. It wasn't a place I frequented. Most of their stock was too warped or cracked, but sometimes I'd find a piece worth working with. That day, I walked in and immediately felt the cold, damp air cling to my skin. The place always smelled like mold and wet bark, which should have been enough to make me turn around, but I had a feeling I needed to check it out. I was rummaging through some old piles when I saw it. A single piece of wood wedged between two rotting planks. It was light, way too light for its size. I could have sworn it should have been heavier, considering it looked like solid oak. I picked it up, surprised by how smooth it felt under my fingers. No knots, no rough patches, just perfect. I didn't even hesitate. I paid for it and took it home. Now here's where things get strange. As soon as I got back to the shop, I set the piece down and noticed something off. The wood felt hollow, almost like it wasn't entirely there. I grabbed my tools and started carving, and that's when I noticed the shavings. They weren't falling like normal wood chips. They curled in the air, almost floating down like feathers, but they landed in strange patterns on the floor. I brushed them aside, but each time more fell. They'd formed what looked like symbols or letters. Weird, jagged shapes I didn't recognize. I should have stopped right then, but I didn't. Curiosity got the best of me. I figured it was just my imagination, you know. Maybe the light in the shop was playing tricks on me. So I kept carving. The wood gave way so easily, like I was cutting through butter. With each stroke, I uncovered more of those strange symbols in the shavings. I couldn't help but stare at them. It was like they were trying to say something, like there was a message hidden in the wood. After a few hours, I stepped back to admire my work. I had carved a small statue, something abstract, a blend of smooth curves and sharp edges, but it didn't feel right. The thing looked wrong, like it didn't belong. The air in the shop felt thick, like someone was watching me. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to being tired, and decided to clean up for the night. When I bent down to sweep up the shavings, I saw it. The runes, the symbols, they weren't just on the floor. They were etched into the wood, creeping up the sides of the statue like veins. I ran my fingers over them, and I swear the wood felt colder, like it was sucking the heat right out of my skin. I should have destroyed it right then and there, burned the thing, thrown it away, anything but what I did next. Instead, I kept it. I couldn't let it go. There was something about that statue, about those runes, that pulled me in. I set it on the shelf in my workshop and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. Every time I walked by, it caught my eye. The patterns shifted when I wasn't looking, like the runes were rearranging themselves. A few days later, strange things started happening. It began with small stuff, tools going missing, only to turn up in places I hadn't left them. My shop felt colder, even when I had the heater blasting. The wood pile I kept in the corner started to rot, even the fresh pieces I'd just bought. And the worst part, the shavings. They kept appearing, even when I wasn't carving. I'd find them scattered on the floor in those same strange patterns. Then came the dreams. Every night, I'd dream of the runes. They'd crawl over my skin, burning into my flesh, searing their message into me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The statue was always in the corner of the dream watching. It was like the thing had a presence, like it was alive, waiting for something. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of the statue. I grabbed it off the shelf, but as soon as I touched it, the room seemed to tilt, like gravity had shifted. The air around me hummed, vibrating with a low, droning sound that made my teeth ache. I dropped the statue, but it didn't hit the floor. It hovered. Just floated there, a few inches off the ground, spinning slowly. The runes on its surface glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I stumbled back, my head swimming with the sound, and I could feel something inside that wood, something ancient and angry. It was waiting for me. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, and I ran out of the shop. I didn't go back for hours. I sat in my truck, hands shaking, trying to convince myself I hadn't lost it. But when I finally got the nerve to go back inside, the statue was gone. The only thing left was a pile of shavings, scattered across the floor in that same eerie pattern. The next few days were hell. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being followed, like something was lurking just out of sight. My skin prickled whenever I stepped into the shop, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying wood. I tried to ignore it, tried to push through the growing dread, but it clung to me like a shadow. One night, I woke up to a noise in the shop. A soft, scraping sound like something was being carved. I grabbed a flashlight and crept inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was wide open, and the air inside was freezing. The sound was coming from the back of the room, where I had first carved that cursed statue. And there it was. The statue had returned, sitting on the workbench, its runes glowing faintly in the dark. But it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were more carvings, dozens of them. Each one more grotesque than the last, twisted figures with sharp, jagged edges, their surfaces etched with the same runes. The air was heavy with a presence, something I couldn't see but could feel. It was watching me. I knew then that I couldn't escape it. I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was squeezing the air out of my lungs. The room started to spin, and the runes on the statues pulsed faster, brighter. They were speaking, not in words, but in some ancient, primal language that clawed at the edges of my mind. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, and that's when I realized what the wood had wanted all along. It wasn't the carvings, wasn't the statues. It was me. The wood had chosen me from the moment I picked it up. The runes weren't just symbols, they were a binding, a curse, and now it was too late. I was part of it, part of whatever dark force lived in that hollow wood. I don't know how much longer I have, but the statues are growing. Every night there are more of them, their runes glowing brighter. I can hear the carving now, even when I'm not in the shop. I can feel the wood under my skin, spreading, taking over. And soon, I'll be just like them. A hollow shell, carved from the inside out. I've been a window washer for years. It's a simple job, really, nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. I get to be outdoors most of the time, high above the busy streets, wiping away grime and fingerprints. You wouldn't believe how dirty people let their windows get, but that's where I come in. There's one building, though, that still creeps me out. I don't scared easily. I mean, you can't really be afraid of heights and do my job. But there's something different about the 5th floor window on this old office building. It's not the height or even the building itself, it's what happens whenever I clean it. I first noticed it a couple of months ago. I just finished scrubbing down the glass, admiring the work I'd done. You see, there's a weird satisfaction in seeing a dirty, smudged window turn crystal clear. It makes you feel like you're leaving your mark in a world where nothing ever stays clean for long. Anyway, I had just finished when I saw it, a faint fingerprint, right in the center of the glass. It was subtle at first, like it was pressed into the glass from the other side. I figured I must have missed a spot, or maybe touched it without realizing it. I wiped it off, did a quick final pass, and thought nothing more of it. But then, the next time I cleaned the window, the same thing happened. Another fingerprint. I know what you're thinking. Maybe it was just dirt, right? Something natural. But here's the thing. Every time I cleaned that window, the fingerprint was in the exact same spot. It wasn't random. And it wasn't mine. It started happening more frequently. I'd finished scrubbing down that particular window, only to step back and see the print appear like it was being pressed into the glass while I watched. And every time, it was part of a bigger pattern. First, it was one fingerprint, then two. Each time, they spiraled outward, like someone, or something, was tracing a finger along the glass in some invisible, deliberate way. I asked around just to see if anyone else noticed something strange. The building manager, a gruff guy named Rick, didn't care much. "It's just an old window, man. They do that," he said. "Or maybe some punk kids are messing with you. People are always finding new ways to waste time." I didn't buy it. Who would sneak up 5 floors to press their fingerprints on a window? And how would they even know I'd be cleaning it? Besides, there was no access to that window from inside the building. It was sealed shut. The only way to reach it was from the outside, like I did with my harness and squeegee. So I kept cleaning the window. I didn't really have a choice. It was part of my route. But each time, the spiral grew, the fingerprints multiplying, spreading in that perfect, eerie pattern. I thought about quitting, but the rest of the job was fine, and honestly, I didn't want to look like a coward, spooked by a dirty window. One day, though, things got worse. I had just finished my usual routine, wiping the fingerprints away, when I noticed something different about the pattern. The prints weren't just random spirals anymore. They'd formed words, faint, but unmistakable. "Hell be me." I stepped back so fast I nearly fell off the platform. My heart was pounding, and I stared at the words, trying to make sense of it. Was someone inside the building? Was this a prank? The window stayed still, the words as clear as day, etched into the glass by dozens of invisible fingers. I didn't clean that window the next day. I skipped it, hoping someone else would notice the message and deal with it. But when I returned the following week, the words were gone. The spiral was back, more prints than ever before, but the message had disappeared like it had never been there. I started having nightmares. I dreamed that I was cleaning the window, and when I wiped away the grime, a face would be staring back at me from the other side. Pale, gaunt, with wide, terrified eyes. Sometimes it was just a hand, pressed flat against the glass, its palm smeared with prints. I couldn't escape it. The window became this thing that I couldn't stop thinking about. Each time I cleaned it, I dreaded what I'd find next, and the spiral kept growing, the fingerprints expanding outwards, forming tighter, more intricate patterns. It was like watching something unravel, some dark mystery slowly revealing itself through the glass. Then one day, everything changed. It was late afternoon, and the sun was setting. The light hit the glass in just the right way, making it gleam as I started cleaning. The fingerprints were worse than ever, smudged, overlapping prints that spiraled so far out they nearly covered the entire pane. I tried to work fast, but the more I wiped, the more I realized that something was off. The spiral wasn't just fingerprints anymore. It was a handprint. And another. And another. All overlapping, pressing from the other side of the glass. The light made them glow, made it clear that whatever had been leaving those prints wasn't human. I backed up, ready to lower myself down the platform and be done with it, but before I could move, something cold pressed against my hand. I froze. Looking down, I saw it, another handprint, this time on the outside of the glass, right where my hand was resting. But it wasn't mine. It was too large, too pale, and the fingers were unnaturally long. The glass felt icy beneath my palm, like I was touching something that had been left out in the dead of winter. Before I could pull away, the handprint moved. It slid across the glass, tracking my hand with it, guiding me along the spiral of prints. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to let go, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my hand glued to the glass by something I couldn't see, couldn't fight. Then the glass cracked. It started small, a tiny fissure running from the center of the spiral, spiderwebbing outwards. But it grew fast, spreading across the entire window in seconds. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was stuck, pinned by that invisible force. The cracks deepened, and I could hear the glass groaning, straining under the pressure. With a deafening shatter, the window exploded. I fell back, expecting to plunge to the ground below, but something caught me. Something cold, something heavy. It wrapped around me like a pair of arms, holding me in place as the shards of glass rained down around me. And then I saw it, the thing from my nightmares. The face, pale, gaunt, its eyes wide and staring, pressed against the now empty window frame. Its mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I knew what it was saying. Help me. The arms tightened around me, pulling me toward the broken window, toward the darkness beyond the glass. I struggled, tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember was that face staring at me through the void as the world went black. Now, I'm not sure if I'm alive or dead. I don't feel pain, but I don't feel anything at all. I'm still here though, trapped behind the glass, my fingerprints adding to the spiral, waiting for someone, anyone, to come and clean the window. And when they do, I'll be ready, because I need help, just like the others. I've been skating at Silver Pines Rink since I was 8. The place has an old-school charm, a little run-down but always cozy. The rink sits on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees and thick snow in the winter. People say the rink's been around since the 60s, maybe earlier, though nobody really knows for sure. It was the place where I learned to skate, fell in love with the ice, and dreamed of competing professionally one day. This story, though, it isn't about dreams or competitions. It's about something else, something that changed the way I saw skating forever. I started noticing it last December. The holidays were approaching, and the rink was busier than usual with kids on winter break and families looking for a fun night out. I'd go in the mornings to avoid the crowds, when the ice was freshly resurfaced and practically begging to be skated on. There was one spot, though, near the far corner of the rink that never seemed quite right. At first, I thought it was just a patch of ice that the Zamboni hadn't smoothed out properly. You know, where the ice looks thicker in one area or maybe rough around the edges. But this was different. The ice in that spot, about the size of a dinner plate, was always slightly fogged over, like frost had settled there permanently. No matter how much the Zamboni went over it, the spot stayed dull, a little too white. One day, while practicing, I skated over it for the first time. As my blades hit the patch, I heard it. A low, hollow crack echoed through the rink, loud enough that I nearly lost my balance. I stopped, expecting to see a chunk of ice missing or a crack running through the surface, but there was nothing. The ice looked perfectly fine, if anything, more solid than the rest of the rink. I shrugged it off. I mean, it's an old rink, right? No big deal. But every time I passed over that spot, the noise happened again. The same deep, empty-sounding crack, like the ice was trying to tell me something. After a few times, I started avoiding it. I told myself it was probably just a quirk of the rink, maybe an air pocket or something underneath the ice. But deep down, it freaked me out. Then came the day I couldn't avoid it anymore. It was early morning, just after sunrise, and the rink was practically empty. I had a big competition coming up, so I wanted to get in some serious practice. I'd been skating for about an hour, doing spins and jumps, working on my footwork when I felt it. A pull. That's the only way I can describe it, a subtle tug, like an invisible hand guiding me toward the corner of the rink where the spot was. I fought it at first, skating in the opposite direction, but the pull was relentless. My body was drawn to that spot, and before I knew it, I was gliding straight toward it. My skates skimmed the ice as I approached, and when I passed over the patch, the hollow crack rang out again. Only this time, it was louder, deeper, almost like a growl. The ice under my blades seemed to give just a little, like it was softer there. My heart raced, and I stopped immediately. I looked down, expecting to see a gaping hole, or, I don't know, something, but there was nothing. The patch looked the same as it always did. My breath fogged up the air around me as I tried to calm myself. Then I saw it. A shape moving beneath the ice. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was something under the ice, something dark, shifting slowly, like it was waiting for me to notice. My stomach twisted in knots, and I backed away, my blades scraping against the ice. I turned and skated toward the center of the rink, trying to put as much distance between myself and that patch as possible. I tried to shake it off, told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe I'd been practicing too long, maybe I was overtired. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shape, moving just below the surface waiting. I stayed away from the rink for a few days after that, hoping the break would clear my mind. But when I returned, it was worse. The moment I stepped onto the ice, I felt that pull again, stronger this time. It was like the ice wanted me back, like it needed me. I couldn't fight it anymore. My legs moved on their own, carrying me straight to the far corner. The cracks sounded beneath my skates again, so loud that I winced, but I couldn't stop. I had to see. I crouched down over the patch, my breath clouding up in front of me. My fingers traced the outline of the spot, and that's when I realized it wasn't cold. The ice everywhere else was freezing, but here it felt warm. Too warm. My heart pounded as I leaned in closer, pressing my palm flat against the surface. The ice gave a little under my hand, soft, almost pliable like thin glass. My breath hitched in my throat, and then I saw it again, the shape. Only this time, it wasn't moving. It was staring up at me. Eyes. Two pale, glassy eyes locked onto mine from beneath the ice, wide and unblinking. My stomach lurched and I scrambled back, but I couldn't look away. The eyes followed me, tracking my movements as I stumbled to my feet. That was the last time I skated at Silver Pines. I didn't go back after that. I couldn't. I told myself I was done with skating, that I was moving on to other things, but really, I was terrified. Terrified of what I'd seen. Terrified of what might still be waiting under that ice. A few weeks later, I heard the news. A kid from the local high school had gone missing after skating practice. His friends said they'd seen him last at the rink, but when the staff checked, he was nowhere to be found. The weirdest part. They said his skates had been left right there on the ice, right over that same patch I'd been avoiding. I don't know what happened to him. They never found a body, never found any sign of what had taken him. But I know it was that thing under the ice, whatever it was, whatever it wanted. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear it. That low, hollow crack, echoing in the back of my mind, waiting. I've been making wine for over 20 years, and I've seen it all, or so I thought. I'd witnessed the unpredictability of weather, the relentless march of time, and how delicate the balance is between a good bottle and a bad one. But nothing could have prepared me for this. For her. It all started last winter when I found the old vineyard, nestled deep in the hills of southern France. It had been abandoned for who knows how long, yet the vines still clung stubbornly to life. Thick, gnarled roots twisted into the earth like they'd become part of the land itself. Something about the place called to me, so I bought it without thinking twice. My wife, Marie, thought I was crazy, but I couldn't resist. I figured I could revive it, bring it back to life. At first, things were going well. The soil, despite its age, was rich, and the grapes thrived in a way I hadn't expected. They were fuller, darker, almost like they'd absorbed the history of the land. I harvested them early that fall, eager to taste what I knew would be a special vintage. I pressed them, bottled them, and stored them in the cellar beneath the old estate that had come with the vineyard. That's when the strangeness began. I noticed something off as I was moving the bottles. They were aging too fast. I'm used to waiting years for a vintage to mature, but these bottles, it was as if time sped up. A week after bottling, the wine inside had taken on a deep, almost black hue, and the labels, which I'd just attached, had already started to yellow and peel like they'd been sitting there for decades. I chalked it up to humidity or maybe some weird reaction in the cellar, but that didn't explain what happened next. One night after dinner, I decided to open a bottle. It had been less than 2 months since I harvested those grapes, but it looked like it had been aged for years. I poured a glass, and the liquid was thick, almost syrupy. It stained the glass in streaks that lingered unnaturally long before sliding down to the bottom. The smell, it was rich but heavy. Too heavy, like overripe fruit left in the sun to rot. I took a sip, and my stomach churned. The flavor was overwhelming, bitter with a metallic aftertaste that clung to my tongue. I spat it out immediately. Marie looked at me from across the table, raising an eyebrow. I could tell she thought I was being dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. I decided to let the rest of the bottle sit, thinking maybe they needed time. Maybe I was rushing it. But every day, the same feeling gnawed at me. The bottles aged faster and faster. Within weeks, they looked ancient, dust gathering on the glass, corks drying out as if they'd been forgotten for decades. It was impossible, and yet there it was, right in front of me. Then came the first nightmare. I was walking through the vineyard at dusk. The sun hung low, casting a blood-red hue over the rows of vines. The air was thick, stifling. I could feel something watching me from the shadows between the trees. I tried to run, but my feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth. That's when I saw her. A woman standing at the far end of the vineyard, her figure silhouetted against the dying light. She was dressed in white, but her dress was stained with something dark, something that shimmered in the fading sun. Her face, I couldn't see her face, just a hollow, empty void where her eyes should have been. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. After that, I avoided the cellar. Every time I thought about going down there, I felt that same heaviness in the air, like I was being watched. Marie noticed my growing anxiety, but I didn't dare tell her. She'd think I was losing it, and maybe I was. Weeks passed, and then the accident started. First, it was the rats. I found them dead in the corners of the cellar, their bodies bloated, their fur matted with the same thick, dark liquid that had stained my glass. Then Marie tripped on the stairs leading down to the cellar, twisting her ankle. She said she thought she heard something, whispers, like voices calling her name from the shadows. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down, I knew what she meant. One night, after too much wine from another, safer bottle, I decided to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed a lantern and headed down to the cellar, ignoring the pit in my stomach. The air was colder than I remembered, and the smell of decay hung in the air. The bottles were still there, lined up neatly, but now they looked ancient, as if they'd been sitting there for a century. I picked up one of the bottles. The label had faded so much I could barely make out the name I'd given it. The glass felt warm, almost pulsing in my hand. I uncorked it, and the smell hit me immediately. Rotten fruit and something else, something metallic. I poured the wine into a glass, and it oozed out slowly, like molasses. That's when I heard it, a whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. "Drink it." I froze. My hand shook as I held the glass, staring into the thick, viscous liquid that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Drink it." I should have left. I should have smashed the bottle and run. But I couldn't move. Something held me there, my hand moving of its own accord, bringing the glass to my lips. The wine touched my tongue, and it was like drinking tar. It burned as it went down, coating my throat in a thick, oily residue that clung to my insides. I gagged, dropping the glass, but it was too late. I could feel it spreading, crawling through my veins, making its way to my heart. I stumbled back, knocking over bottles as I reached for the stairs. But the cellar felt endless. The walls stretched and twisted, the shadows growing longer, darker, and then I saw her again. The woman from my dream, standing at the far end of the room, her dress now soaked in that same thick liquid. She smiled, and her eyes, all the voids where her eyes should have been, locked onto mine. "Welcome," she whispered. I collapsed to the floor, my vision fading as the wine pulsed through me, overtaking everything. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of glass shattering, followed by a low, guttural laugh that echoed in the dark. I woke up in the vineyard the next morning, covered in dirt and dried wine. I tried to forget it, tried to convince myself it was all a nightmare. But when I went back to the cellar, the bottles were gone. Every last one. Now, every time I sip wine, no matter the bottle, it tastes wrong, thick, dark, and bitter. And every night I see her. The woman, standing at the edge of my dreams, watching, waiting. I know she's not done with me yet. I wasn't exactly thrilled when my cousin asked me to house sit for her, but I had nothing better to do and could use a little extra cash. Plus, her place was one of those old Victorian houses that look straight out of a horror movie. I mean, sure, the place was beautiful, high ceilings, wood-paneled walls, and a staircase that creaked every time you took a step, but something about it felt off the moment I walked in. "Just a few days," she said, handing me the keys and telling me about the house. "Oh, and don't worry about the locked room upstairs. It's just a storage space." That seemed strange. Why would she mention it? I didn't think much of it at the time. People have their quirks, right? The first night was peaceful, nothing too crazy. I made myself comfortable, watched some TV, and wandered through the house a bit. That locked room was just at the top of the stairs, a heavy oak door with a brass handle. I didn't try to open it or anything, but I couldn't help feeling like it was watching me. On the second day, I noticed something strange. As I passed by the door, it creaked, just slightly. I stopped and listened. The sound was faint, like wood shifting or something, but it was enough to make me pause. The door was still locked when I tried the handle, but when I let go, it swung open just a bit, like it had been pushed from the inside. Weird, right? I closed it, checked the lock, it was still secure, and went about my day. But the feeling stayed with me, like a splinter you can't quite dig out of your skin. That night, as I was heading to bed, I heard the creaking again. I froze on the stairs, halfway up, my heart doing this weird rhythm in my chest. The door was cracked open, just a few inches, but I had locked it earlier. I know I did. I don't know why, but I walked over to it. Slowly. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I reached for the handle. When I touched it, the door opened all the way on its own, creaking as it did. The room beyond was pitch black. No windows, no light. I squinted, trying to see something, anything, but it was like staring into a void. I slammed the door shut and backed away, telling myself it was just an old house. Old houses make noises. Doors shift with the wind or the settling of the foundation. That's all it was. But I didn't sleep much that night. On the third day, things got worse. I woke up to find the door wide open. The lock was still turned to the locked position, but the door was open anyway. I stood there just staring at it, trying to figure out what was going on. I called my cousin, but she didn't answer. Typical. She's always bad with her phone. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a chair and propped it under the doorknob. If the door wanted to open again, it would have to get through that. For a while, it seemed like it worked. I could walk past without hearing the creak, and the door stayed shut. I started to feel a little more at ease, even joking with myself about how I'd been spooked by an old house. That night, though, something woke me up. It was around 2 a.m., and the house was dead silent. At first, I didn't know what had startled me, but then I heard it, a slow, scraping sound. I sat up in bed, my ears straining. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone for light and crept out of bed. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way to the stairs. There at the top was the door. And of course, it was open again, despite the chair still being wedged under the knob. The scraping noise was coming from inside. I don't know what possessed me to step closer, but I did. I stood at the edge of the doorway, my hand trembling as I raised the phone to shine the light inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. It was empty. The room was completely empty, except for one thing. A deep scratch running down the far wall, like something sharp had been dragged along it. I backed away quickly, my heart pounding. I ran downstairs, double-checking the front door was locked and that all the windows were secure. Then I locked myself in the guest bedroom, pushing a dresser against the door. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to leave. My cousin could deal with her creepy house on her own. I packed my stuff and headed for the front door. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a loud bang from upstairs. The door had slammed shut. I should have just left, but something pulled me back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was stupidity. Either way, I found myself climbing the stairs one last time. The door was shut now, locked tight. But I could feel it, this pressure, like the air around it was thick. I tried the handle again, but this time it didn't budge. The whole thing felt different, like the house was watching me, waiting for something. As I turned to leave, there was a knock. Not from the outside, from inside the room. A single heavy knock that made my stomach drop. I ran. I flew down the stairs and grabbed my bag. I didn't care about the money or my cousin's stupid house anymore. I just needed to get out. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed shut, like something was holding it closed from the other side. The air around me grew cold. I could see my breath in front of me as I tried to wrench the door open. Behind me, I heard the floor creak. Something was coming down the stairs, slowly, methodically. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The footsteps stopped just behind me. I could feel the presence, something dark and cold pressing against my back. I shut my eyes and kept pulling at the door, praying it would open, but it never did. I've been designing hedge mazes for years now. There's something calming about it, working with nature, guiding it into shapes that challenge and intrigue. The job brings me peace. Well, it used to anyway. It all started when I was commissioned to design a maze for this old estate out in the countryside. The place was a bit rundown, but the land was perfect. Acres of space, trees lining the edges and the hedges. Oh, those hedges. They were thick, vibrant, and had been growing there for generations. I figured they'd be perfect to work with. On the first day, I spent hours sketching out ideas, mapping the twists and turns, imagining how someone might wander through it. The owner of the estate, Mr. Gale, seemed eager for something impressive. He barely spoke, but his eyes told me all I needed to know. He wanted something that felt alive, something people would remember. As I began trimming the hedges and shaping the paths, one section stood out. This particular hedge was different. The leaves were darker, almost glossy, and the branches seemed to grow faster than I could cut them. Every time I took the shears to it, the branches would spring back, not in the usual way a plant rebounds, but as if they were reaching out toward me. It was subtle at first. I'd trim a section, step back, and notice that it didn't look quite the same anymore. It was always fuller, like I hadn't cut it at all. The first time I noticed something strange, I chalked it up to the heat. I'd been working for hours under the sun, and exhaustion can mess with your head. The next day, it was unmistakable. I trimmed the hedge in the morning, leaving a neat, clean line. By noon, the branches had curled and reached toward the path I was carving out, almost as if they were hungry. I started working faster, trying to stay ahead of the growth, but the faster I worked, the more it seemed to resist. I'd step back to admire my progress, only to find the branches had crept closer, their tips just brushing against the air where I'd been standing. I told myself it was just a fluke, maybe something in the soil. Plants can be weird sometimes, right? But as the days passed, it got worse. Every time I trimmed the hedge, the branches grew back faster. Not just growing, they were reaching. I swear, they were trying to touch me. I tried to avoid that section of the maze after a while, focusing on the rest. But it wasn't long before I couldn't ignore it anymore. The hedge was growing out of control, faster than any other part. It spread into the paths, blocking the way. The air around it felt different too, heavy, like it was thick with tension. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One evening, I stayed late, hoping to catch up on the work. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the maze. That's when I saw it. As I trimmed the hedge, the branches didn't just grow back, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they twisted and curled like fingers reaching for me. I stepped back, shears in hand, my heart racing. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. But then, as if to prove me wrong, one of the branches shot out. It brushed against my arm. I dropped the shears and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the way the branch had reached out like it was alive. I convinced myself it was nothing. I'd been working too hard, not getting enough sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that hedge. The next day, I brought a chainsaw. I wasn't messing around anymore. If that thing wanted to grow, I'd cut it down to the roots. I started early, carving through the branches with the roaring blade. At first, it felt good, satisfying even, watching the branches fall to the ground. But then, the chainsaw jammed. I pulled it back, and the hedge, it wasn't just growing, it was fighting back. The branches tangled around the blade, twisting and knotting like they were alive. I tried to pull free, but the more I struggled, the tighter they held. I yanked the saw out, stumbled back, and watched in horror as the hedge started to reform, the branches intertwining thicker than before. I swear, it was pulsing, breathing almost, like it had a heartbeat of its own. That's when I noticed something worse, something I hadn't seen before. Deep inside the hedge, there were shapes. At first, I thought they were just clusters of leaves, but no, they were faces, human faces. Twisted, contorted expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The faces moved, their eyes shifting to follow me. I couldn't breathe. It was like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I turned and ran, crashing through the maze, desperate to get away from that thing. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. The branches reached out faster now, curling around the path, blocking my way. I could hear them, whispering, rustling like voices carried on the wind. They were calling to me. I stumbled out of the maze, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. I didn't go back the next day or the day after that. But the hedge, it kept growing. Every time I drove past the estate, I could see it from the road, towering over the walls, its dark leaves shimmering in the light. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The faces, the whispers, they haunted me. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was trapped in the maze, the branches wrapping around me, pulling me into the dark where those faces waited. It's been weeks now, and I haven't gone back. But yesterday, I got a call from Mr. Gale. He said the maze was finished. Finished? I didn't finish it. I told him that, but he insisted, said it was perfect, exactly what he wanted. I don't know what to do. I can't shake the feeling that it's not just a hedge anymore. It's something else, something alive, and it's waiting for me. I went back today, I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it for myself, to prove that it was just my imagination. But the second I stepped onto the grounds, I knew something was wrong. The hedge had grown even taller, thicker. The air around it was cold, unnatural. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent. They were calling me. I tried to leave, but the branches, they reached out. I didn't even see them coming. They wrapped around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward the center of the maze. I'd fought, but it was no use. They were too strong. I'm in the center now. The faces, they're all around me, watching, waiting. I can feel the branches tightening, pulling me closer, and I know I'm not getting out of here. I should have left when I had the chance. I should have burned it to the ground. But now it's too late. I've been designing hedge mazes for years now. There's something calming about it, working with nature, guiding it into shapes that challenge and intrigue. The job brings me peace. Well, it used to anyway. It all started when I was commissioned to design a maze for this old estate out in the countryside. The place was a bit rundown, but the land was perfect. Acres of space, trees lining the edges, and the hedges. Oh, those hedges. They were thick, vibrant, and had been growing there for generations. I figured they'd be perfect to work with. On the first day, I spent hours sketching out ideas, mapping the twists and turns, imagining how someone might wander through it. The owner of the estate, Mr. Gale, seemed eager for something impressive. He barely spoke, but his eyes told me all I needed to know. He wanted something that felt alive, something people would remember. As I began trimming the hedges and shaping the paths, one section stood out. This particular hedge was different. The leaves were darker, almost glossy, and the branches seemed to grow faster than I could cut them. Every time I took the shears to it, the branches would spring back, not in the usual way a plant rebounds, but as if they were reaching out toward me. It was subtle at first. I'd trim a section, step back, and notice that it didn't look quite the same anymore. It was always fuller, like I hadn't cut it at all. The first time I noticed something strange, I chalked it up to the heat. I'd been working for hours under the sun, and exhaustion can mess with your head. But the next day, it was unmistakable. I trimmed the hedge in the morning, leaving a neat, clean line. By noon, the branches had curled and reached toward the path I was carving out, almost as if they were hungry. I started working faster, trying to stay ahead of the growth. But the faster I worked, the more it seemed to resist. I'd stepped back to admire my progress, only to find the branches had crept closer, their tips just brushing against the air where I'd been standing. I told myself it was just a fluke, maybe something in the soil. Plants can be weird sometimes, right? But as the days passed, it got worse. Every time I trimmed the hedge, the branches grew back faster. Not just growing, they were reaching. I swear, they were trying to touch me. I tried to avoid that section of the maze after a while, focusing on the rest, but it wasn't long before I couldn't ignore it anymore. The hedge was growing out of control, faster than any other part. It spread into the paths, blocking the way. The air around it felt different too, heavy, like it was thick with tension. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One evening, I stayed late, hoping to catch up on the work. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the maze. That's when I saw it. As I trimmed the hedge, the branches didn't just grow back, they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they twisted and curled like fingers reaching for me. I stepped back, shears in hand, my heart racing. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. But then, as if to prove me wrong, one of the branches shot out. It brushed against my arm. I dropped the shears and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the way the branch had reached out like it was alive. I convinced myself it was nothing. I'd been working too hard, not getting enough sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that hedge. The next day, I brought a chainsaw. I wasn't messing around anymore. If that thing wanted to grow, I'd cut it down to the roots. I started early, carving through the branches with the roaring blade. At first, it felt good, satisfying even, watching the branches fall to the ground. But then, the chainsaw jammed. I pulled it back, and the hedge, it wasn't just growing, it was fighting back. The branches tangled around the blade, twisting and knotting like they were alive. I tried to pull free, but the more I struggled, the tighter they held. I yanked the saw out, stumbled back, and watched in horror as the hedge started to reform, the branches intertwining thicker than before. I swear, it was pulsing, breathing almost, like it had a heartbeat of its own. That's when I noticed something worse, something I hadn't seen before. Deep inside the hedge, there were shapes. At first, I thought they were just clusters of leaves, but no, they were faces, human faces. Twisted, contorted expressions of agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The faces moved, their eyes shifting to follow me. I couldn't breathe. It was like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I turned and ran, crashing through the maze, desperate to get away from that thing. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. The branches reached out, faster now, curling around the path, blocking my way. I could hear them, whispering, rustling like voices carried on the wind. They were calling to me. I stumbled out of the maze, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. I didn't go back the next day or the day after that, but the hedge, it kept growing. Every time I drove past the estate, I could see it from the road, towering over the walls, its dark leaves shimmering in the light. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The faces, the whispers, they haunted me. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was trapped in the maze, the branches wrapping around me, pulling me into the dark where those faces waited. It's been weeks now, and I haven't gone back. But yesterday, I got a call from Mr. Gale. He said the maze was finished. Finished? I didn't finish it. I told him that, but he insisted, said it was perfect, exactly what he wanted. I don't know what to do. I can't shake the feeling that it's not just a hedge anymore. It's something else, something alive. And it's waiting for me. I went back today. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it for myself, to prove that it was just my imagination. But the second I stepped onto the grounds, I knew something was wrong. The hedge had grown even taller, thicker. The air around it was cold, unnatural. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent. They were calling me. I tried to leave, but the branches, they reached out. I didn't even see them coming. They wrapped around my arms, my legs, pulling me toward the center of the maze. I fought, but it was no use. They were too strong. I'm in the center now. The faces, they're all around me, watching, waiting. I can feel the branches tightening, pulling me closer, and I know I'm not getting out of here. I should have left when I had the chance. I should have burned it to the ground. But now it's too late. I've been in the floral business for over a decade, long enough to know the life cycle of flowers better than most people know their own heartbeat. Fresh blooms, delicate and vibrant, fade into wilting petals and brittle leaves. It's just the nature of things. But that changed the day I found them. It was a rainy Tuesday, the kind where business slows to a crawl, and I was doing what I always do during quiet moments, inventory. I had been digging through an old storage box in the back of my shop, expecting to find the usual, a mess of dried, crumbling petals. What I found instead was a small, neatly tied bundle of dried flowers I didn't remember ever seeing. They looked like they'd been dried decades ago, their stems twisted and gnarled, the petals flat and muted. They were strange but oddly beautiful. The strangest part, though, was their condition. Dried flowers are usually fragile, flaking apart at the slightest touch, but these were different. The petals felt almost leathery, stiff, but they didn't crumble when I pressed them. No dust, no breakage. Just solid, unnaturally preserved plumes. I shrugged it off as a lucky find, figuring some rare drying method or chemical treatment was used. After all, floral design can get pretty experimental. I brought the bundle out to the main counter and placed it in a vase. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that these flowers needed to be seen. The next day, as I opened the shop, I noticed something unsettling. The petals had darkened. Not a huge change, but enough that I could tell something was off. I remembered them being a dull cream color, but now they had this slight tinge of brown, like old parchment that had been left too close to the fire. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light. Maybe the rainy gloom of the day before had dulled their color, and the sunlight was revealing what they actually looked like. But when I touched them again, they felt the same, stiff but resilient. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to my imagination. A couple of days passed, and the shop was buzzing with orders for an upcoming wedding. I needed something to add an antique touch to one of the arrangements, and those dried flowers seemed perfect. So I grabbed them, intending to mix them into a bouquet. As I started to arrange the flowers, a strange chill ran up my arms. It wasn't cold in the shop. In fact, it was the perfect temperature for flowers. But my hands felt icy, and every time I touched the dried petals, it was like that cold spread further. My fingers stiffened slightly as I twisted the stems into place, and that's when I noticed. The petals were darker now. They had turned an ashy gray, like the edges of burned paper. I froze. This wasn't normal. Dried flowers don't change color. They're dead, frozen in time, or at least they're supposed to be. But these flowers, they weren't behaving like any flowers I'd ever worked with. I wanted to stop to put them down, but something about them kept pulling me in. It felt wrong to leave the arrangement unfinished, like I had an obligation to complete it. When I finished, I stepped back and stared at the bouquet. The dried flowers stood out, but not in a good way. Their petals had gone from gray to nearly black, as if they were absorbing light, pulling the room's brightness into themselves. I had the sudden urge to throw them away, to get them out of my shop, but a voice in the back of my mind told me to wait. I convinced myself that it was a temporary effect, that the color would return to normal. That night, I locked up the shop and went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about those flowers. I dreamt about them, about their petals growing darker and darker until they were nothing but shadows in a vase. I dreamt that when I touched them, they crumbled, but instead of turning to dust, they melted into my skin, sinking into me like ink into water. The next morning, I rushed back to the shop. The moment I opened the door, I saw it. The entire bouquet had turned black, every petal, every stem. They looked like they'd been charred in a fire. But there was no smell, no ashes, just this awful blackness, matte and dead. I was about to throw them out when a customer walked in. It was Mrs. Hawkins, one of my regulars. She had an eye for detail, always commenting on my work, so I wasn't surprised when she noticed the flowers immediately. "Oh, those are striking," she said, stepping closer to the counter. "Where did you find such an unusual shade?" "I don't really know," I replied, hesitating. "I found them in the back." "They're just dried flowers." "They're beautiful. Dark, but beautiful." I stared at her, waiting for her to say something else, maybe that they made her uncomfortable or that they looked off somehow. But she didn't. She loved them. I should have thrown them out, but instead I added them to her order. I told myself it was just business. After she left, things got worse. The flowers didn't just turn black, they started to change in other ways. When I touched them, I could have sworn they felt warmer, almost like they had a pulse, and every time I arranged them, even if I moved just one petal, the darkness deepened. It spread through the flowers like ink in water, creeping from the petals to the stems, then to the vase itself. Soon, it wasn't just the flowers that were changing. I started feeling different. I can't describe it exactly, but it was like I was more sensitive to everything around me. I could hear the softest rustle of leaves outside, feel the vibrations of footsteps from across the room. And the cold, it was always there, crawling just beneath my skin. One evening, as I was closing up, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror by the counter. My reflection looked pale, my eyes sunken like I hadn't slept in days. But what really made my stomach drop was the faint dark stain creeping up my fingers, almost like ink smudges, the same color as the flowers. Panic gripped me. I rushed to the back room, tearing through boxes and drawers, looking for anything to explain what was happening. That's when I found an old journal tucked away beneath some old supplies. It belonged to the previous shop owner, someone I had never met but whose reputation lingered in town. People said she was eccentric, into strange rituals and odd customs. As I'd flipped through the journal, I found sketches of flowers, those flowers. Pages filled with notes about preservation methods, strange symbols, and warnings about their use. One line stood out: "They will take what they're given. They will thrive in darkness." My hands shook as I slammed the journal shut. I knew then that whatever these flowers were, they weren't meant to be in my shop, or anyone's for that matter. But it was too late. The dark stain on my fingers had spread to my hands, crawling up my arms like vines. I could feel it now, something alive, something hungry, pulling me closer to those flowers. The black petals seemed to shift, twisting toward me as if they were aware of my presence. I tried to throw them out, to burn them, but every time I touched the vase, it felt like the flowers tightened their hold on me. My vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening, closing in. And now, as I sit here in the fading light, my hands trembling, the flowers are watching. Their petals are no longer black, they've turned the color of my skin. I know what they've taken, and I know what's coming next. They will thrive in darkness, and soon I will be part of it. I've been blowing glass for 20 years. Some people say it's a lost art, but I never thought of it that way. To me, it's just life. It's hot, messy, and sometimes it leaves you with burns you don't expect. But in the end, you've created something that didn't exist before, something that can be fragile or strong, beautiful or haunting. I wasn't prepared for the piece of glass that refused to melt. It started like any other day. I opened my small studio, flipped on the lights, and fired up the furnace. The kiln roared to life, and the steady hum of heat filled the room. There's a calm in the early hours before I start a project. That quiet anticipation of what might come. Sometimes I'll just sit and stare at the raw materials, sand, soda, lime, wondering what they'll become by the end of the day. I've been working on a commission for a local artist. They wanted something abstract, full of movement, but smooth to the touch. I grabbed the first piece of glass from a box I'd ordered weeks ago. It was an ordinary piece, clear with a slight greenish tint, nothing special. Also, I thought. The moment I slid it into the furnace, I knew something was off. It didn't respond like the others. Normally, glass starts to soften around 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, but this one just sat there like a block of ice in the middle of summer. I thought maybe I was being impatient, so I left it for a bit, tending to another project while the furnace blazed on. I checked the thermometer, it was hot enough, too hot even. But when I pulled the rod out to inspect the glass, it was still solid, completely unmelted. Frustrated, I cranked up the heat. I watched the flames roar higher, licking at the edges of the glass. Still, it wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed something strange. The surface, which had been perfectly clear, was starting to turn cloudy. It wasn't like the haze you get when glass cools too fast. No, this was different. The cloudiness had a texture to it, almost like it was alive. And then, just for a moment, I saw something flicker in the glass. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, there was definitely something there. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass. Shapes danced beneath the surface, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the flames, but the more I watched, the more I realized that wasn't it. There were images, faces. I pulled back quickly, the rod slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The furnace hissed, and I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple. My heart was pounding. Faces, that was impossible. But I knew what I'd seen. Trying to shake it off, I told myself I was just tired. I hadn't slept well the night before, too much coffee, too much thinking. I picked the rod back up and stared at the glass again. This time, I could see the faces more clearly. They weren't familiar, but they looked trapped. The more I stared, the more I realized they weren't just random images. They were people, their expressions twisted in horror, their mouths open as if they were screaming but couldn't make a sound. I should have stopped then. I should have walked away. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to shape it, to see what would happen. I thought maybe I could stretch the glass, change its form, and maybe the images would go away. I grabbed my blowpipe and tried to work the glass like I would with any other piece. As soon as I touched it, the glass responded, but not in a way I expected. It moved on its own. The glass began to warp and twist, pulling away from the heat, stretching in unnatural ways. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't let go. I was transfixed. The faces in the glass grew clearer, more defined. They were moving now, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. I could see their eyes darting back and forth, searching for someone. I was sweating more than usual, my skin prickling with a cold dread that seeped into my bones. I wanted to stop, to throw the glass back into the furnace, but something wouldn't let me. My hands felt glued to the blowpipe, and then I heard it. A voice, soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Help us." I froze. The voice came from the glass. There was no one else in the studio. No one could have spoken. The furnace roared, drowning out the sound, but it was there again, clearer this time. "Help us." I dropped the blowpipe. The glass swung, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The faces were still there, flickering, pleading. I backed away, my heart hammering against my chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. I don't remember how long I stood there, just staring at that piece of glass, watching the faces writhe and twist. At some point, the flickering images began to shift. The faces morphed into something else. They became places, scenes of things I didn't recognize, dark forests, stormy seas, and what looked like a large, decrepit house on the edge of a cliff. The more I watched, the more I felt like I was being pulled in. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to settle over my mind. I needed to get rid of it. I needed to destroy it. I grabbed a pair of heavy tongs and lifted the glass, now cloudy and ominous, back toward the furnace. But the moment it touched the flames, the glass cracked. Not just a surface crack, but a deep, resonating split that sounded like thunder. The faces screamed. This time, I heard them. The high-pitched wail filled the studio, echoing off the walls. The furnace exploded. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, the studio was in shambles, glass shards everywhere, the air thick with smoke and ash. But the strange piece of glass, it was gone. I thought it was over. I convinced myself it was just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. I tried to go back to work, back to my routine, but nothing felt the same. The faces stayed with me, haunting my dreams, whispering in my ear when I was alone. A few weeks later, I was cleaning up the last of the debris from the explosion when I found it. The piece of glass. It was buried under a pile of broken tools, untouched, unscathed. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The surface was still cloudy, and the faces, those horrible twisted faces, were still there, flickering, watching. And then I saw something else. My face. It was there, trapped among the others, my mouth open in a silent scream. I dropped the glass and ran. I haven't been back to the studio since. I can't. I don't know what that thing is, but I know one thing for sure, it's waiting for me. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. I see myself flickering, trapped in that cursed glass. And I know one day it'll come for me. I still remember the first time I found that well. It was late in the summer, the kind of day where the sun hangs heavy in the sky and everything feels still. I had been working on the old Morgan farm for a few months, mostly tending to the cattle and doing odd jobs. Nothing too special, just what you'd expect from a farmhand in the middle of nowhere. The field where the well was hidden wasn't part of my usual route. It was further back, overgrown and forgotten. Old Mr. Morgan had mentioned once that they stopped planting there after the soil went bad, but I never asked why. Curiosity, though, it gets the best of you. That day, I was clearing brush, trying to cut a path through the tall grass so the tractor could get through. The whole field had this eerie quiet to it. Even the insects seemed to avoid it, which was strange considering how much life usually buzzes around an open field. Then, as I swung my mashik through the grass, I heard it. A whisper. I paused, wiping sweat from my brow and looking around. The wind had picked up slightly, but there was something else in it, a voice. Soft, almost too quiet to make out, but it was there. I shook it off at first, thinking maybe the heat was getting to me. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. like someone was calling my name from far away. That's when I spotted it, hidden beneath the tangle of vines and weeds, a stone well. It looked ancient, worn down by years of neglect. The stones were rough, and moss clung to the sides like it had been there for centuries. There was no bucket or rope, just the open mouth of the well yawning up at me like a black hole. I stepped closer, feeling this weird pull, like something was beckoning me forward. The whispering picked up again, and I realized it was coming from the well. The sound was faint, like a breeze moving through the stones, but every time the wind blew, it carried a faint murmur, almost like words. I leaned over the edge, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see the bottom. It was just black, the kind of black that makes you feel like if you stare at it too long, you might fall in. And that's when the idea struck me. What if I drop something in? See how deep it goes. I picked up a small rock from the ground and tossed it in, listening for the sound of it hitting the bottom. But there was nothing. No splash, no thud, just silence. I frowned, grabbed a bigger stone, and dropped that in too. Still nothing. Now that's when things started to feel wrong. I mean, a well should make a sound, right? The stone should hit something eventually. Water, the bottom, whatever. But this one didn't. It was like the sound got swallowed up before it even had a chance to echo. Curiosity started gnawing at me, so I did what any idiot in a horror story would do. I kept dropping stones in, bigger ones this time. But no matter how many I tossed, not a single sound came back. The whispers got louder. By then, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the field. I was about to head back, figuring it was just a weird quirk of the well, when I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you get from a breeze. It was like something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but of course there was nothing there, just the field and the tall grass swaying in the wind. I should have left right then and there. I should have ignored the whispers, forgotten about the well, and moved on with my life. But no, I didn't. That night, the dream started. I was back in the field, standing in front of the well. Except this time, the whispers weren't just in the wind. They were voices. Clear, distinct voices, all talking over each other, urging me to come closer, to lean in, to listen. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of the whispers still ringing in my ears. The next day, I tried to push it out of my mind. Went about my work as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The well stayed in the back of my head, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. By the time lunch rolled around, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. This time, I brought a flashlight. The field was just as quiet as before, maybe even more so. No birds, no insects, nothing. I made my way through the grass until I reached the well again. The whispers were already starting to pick up, swirling around me in the wind. I leaned over the edge and clicked on the flashlight, pointing it down into the darkness. It didn't help. The light just got swallowed up, same as the stones. And then, I swear, I heard my name. Clear as day, coming from the well. My heart started racing, and before I knew what I was doing, I was leaning further in, almost like I wanted to climb down there. The whispers had changed. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were calling to me, pulling me closer. That's when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I jerked back, dropping the flashlight into the well. I didn't hear it hit the bottom. I didn't hear anything, but I didn't care. I ran, stumbling through the grass, not stopping until I reached the barn. My heart was pounding, my skin slick with sweat. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers wouldn't let me. Days passed, and I tried to avoid that part of the field, but no matter what, I kept feeling this pull. The well was always there, in the back of my mind, like it was calling me. The whispers followed me everywhere, at the barn, in the house, even in my dreams. I talked to old Mr. Morgan about it, asked him if he knew anything about the well. He got real quiet, eyes narrowing like he didn't want to talk about it. All he said was, some things are better left buried. But it wasn't buried. It was out there waiting. The dreams got worse. Every night, I saw myself standing at the edge of the well, looking down into the dark, but it wasn't just darkness anymore. There was something down there, something alive. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed my coat, and headed back to the field. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I just wanted to end it, to see what was down there, to stop the whispers once and for all. When I reached the well, the air was still too still. The whispers had stopped. I stood at the edge, looking down into the black, and for the first time I heard something. A low, distant sound, like the rumble of thunder, coming from deep within. I don't remember dropping the rope, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was climbing down into the well. The walls were slick with moss, the air damp and cold. The further I went, the louder the sound got, like something was moving beneath me. I never hit the bottom. Something reached out from the darkness, cold and wet, wrapping around my ankle and yanking me down. I screamed, but no one could hear me. The last thing I remember was the whispers, louder than ever, filling my head as I fell into the black. Now I'm down here, and the well has gone quiet. But I know it's waiting for the next fool to come too close, and when they do, I'll be the one whispering their name in the wind, just like the well whispered mine. I've been working as a blacksmith for over 20 years, and in all that time, nothing ever really surprised me. Metal's predictable. You heat it, beat it, shape it, and cool it. Day in and day out, the process is the same. Its honest work keeps you grounded, keeps your mind on the task. I liked it that way, simple, reliable. That was until I found the anvil. It was a rainy afternoon when it all started. I had been searching for a replacement for my old anvil, which had worn out after years of hammering and forging. That's when I came across an ad for an antique one being sold out of an old estate. It looked heavy, solid, and well used, perfect for the job. The price was low, almost too low, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured the owner just wanted to get rid of it. When I got to the place, it was pouring. The house looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, paint peeling off the walls. The guy selling it was nowhere to be seen, so I walked around to the barn where the anvil was supposed to be. And there it was, sitting in the middle of the barn like it had been waiting for me. It didn't look special, just a big block of iron, heavy and weathered. But when I touched it, I swear I felt something, almost like a hum, faint and vibrating through the metal. I chalked it up to my imagination. You get weird ideas in old places, you know. I paid for it, loaded it into the truck, and drove home. That first night, I didn't do much with it. I was too tired from the drive, so I just set it up in my workshop. It sat there, silent, and I thought nothing more of it. But that night, I had dreams, strange ones. Dark shapes swirling in the forge fire, shadows moving like they were alive. And always, in the background, there was a sound, like metal ringing, over and over, echoing in the back of my mind. The next morning, I decided to get to work with a new anvil. I had a simple job lined up, fixing some horseshoes for a neighbor. Nothing fancy, but the moment I brought my hammer down on the metal, sparks flew more than usual. And it wasn't just random sparks. They moved, they danced, and I could swear they formed patterns. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but the more I worked, the more distinct those patterns became. They looked like writing. Now, I'm no scholar, but I've seen enough books and scribbles in my time to know when something looks like letters. The sparks, they didn't fade away immediately like normal ones do. They hung in the air for a few seconds, long enough for me to see the shapes they made. Curved lines, slashes, dots. I didn't recognize the language, but it felt old. Ancient even. It was like the metal was trying to speak to me. I'll admit, I got a little freaked out. I stopped working for the day, left the forge, and went inside. But that night, the dreams came back, stronger this time. The shadows from the forge were clearer, and I could hear voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, like they were trying to tell me something. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I convinced myself it was just stress, or maybe I was coming down with something. But when I went back to the workshop, the humming from the anvil was louder, like it was calling to me. Against my better judgment, I started hammering again. This time, the sparks weren't just random. They'd formed complete sentences, though I still couldn't read them. But there was something else, something that chilled me to my core. As I worked, I noticed the temperature in the room dropped, and the fire in the forge burned dimmer. The shadows from the flames stretched farther, creeping up the walls like they were alive. And that hum, it grew louder, more insistent. I should have stopped. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't. I was drawn to the anvil, to the way the sparks danced and spoke. Every strike of my hammer made me feel like I was unlocking something, something hidden, something dark. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. Who would believe me? Just a blacksmith seeing things in the fire. But it wasn't just the dreams anymore. I started hearing the hum outside of the workshop. At night, lying in bed, it would echo in my ears. And then the voices followed. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. They grew louder each night until I couldn't sleep. I knew I was in too deep, but I couldn't stop. It was like the anvil had a hold on me. Every day I would go out to the forge, and every day I would hammer. The sparks kept showing me those strange letters and the voices. Oh, those voices, they were always there in the back of my mind. One night, after a long day of work, I found a book in the corner of my workshop. I don't know how it got there. I had never seen it before. It was old, bound in leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it, and my heart nearly stopped. The writing in the book, it matched the sparks. Page after page of the same strange letters. And somehow I could read it. It was like the book had been written for me. The words were a warning, or maybe a curse. It spoke of an ancient force, bound in iron, waiting to be released. And with every strike of the hammer, I was bringing it closer to the surface. The anvil, it wasn't just a tool. It was a key. I should have stopped. I should have taken that cursed thing and buried it deep in the ground, far away from me. But I didn't. I was obsessed. I had to know what would happen when the last word was struck. The final day came sooner than I expected. As I brought the hammer down one last time, the sparks didn't just form letters. They exploded into the air, swirling around the workshop like a storm of light. The shadows, they came alive, twisting and writhing, their shapes forming things I can't even describe. And the hum, it became a roar. The anvil cracked open, and from within it, something emerged. I don't know what it was. A figure? A shadow? All I know is that it wasn't human. It stood before me, silent, watching. And then, without a sound, it vanished, leaving the workshop in ruins. Now, I sit here, writing this, trying to make sense of it all. The anvil is gone, but the hum, it's still with me. In the walls, in the air, and the voices, they never stopped. They've been whispering to me, telling me things I don't want to hear. I can't sleep, I can't think, and every night I hear them louder. Whatever I let out that day, it's not gone. It's waiting. And I know, deep down, that it's coming back for me. I remember the first time I noticed it, a stubborn patch of earth in the farthest corner of the garden I was hired to landscape. It looked like any other part of the yard, but something about it felt wrong. It was barren, devoid of life. The grass that covered the rest of the lawn so beautifully refused to grow here, and the soil itself had this dull, sickly hue that unsettled me. My client, Mrs. Hensley, had asked me to bring this patch back to life. She was one of those wealthy homeowners who took pride in her perfectly manicured lawn, and this eyesore was driving her mad. She asked if I could fix it, and I confidently told her I'd take care of it. After all, I'd been in this business for years. I'd dealt with all kinds of soil, and nothing had ever been too much for me. But this was different. The first day, I raked the area clean, getting rid of dead leaves and bits of debris. I dug into the soil, trying to aerate it, but it was denser than expected. It was like digging through clay, almost sticky and unnaturally cold for such a warm day. I shrugged it off and went about my usual process, planting the seeds of a hardy grass variety known to thrive in tough conditions. I watered the ground thoroughly and left, confident that within a few days, I'd see the first signs of life. Except that didn't happen. When I returned a week later, the patch was worse than before. Not only had the grass not grown, but the soil had turned an unnatural shade of black. It wasn't just dark from moisture or decay, it was like the earth itself had been burned from the inside out. The color was so intense it seemed to absorb the sunlight, making the area around it feel colder. I bent down to touch it, and the soil crumbled in my hand, leaving a black, oily residue on my fingers. It didn't smell like normal dirt either. There was a faint odor, something metallic and sickly sweet, like a mixture of rust and rotting fruit. I tried again. This time, I used different seeds, wildflowers that could grow practically anywhere. I mixed in fertilizer, good stuff too, and even tested the pH levels of the soil. Everything should have been perfect, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The way the ground felt under my shovel, the strange sensation of being watched when I worked near it, even though no one was around, it all weighed on me. But I ignored it. A week later, I went back to check. The soil was blacker than ever. The seeds I had planted were gone. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Frustrated, I called Mrs. Hensley and explained that something was wrong with the soil, something beyond my control. She insisted I try one last time, if not for the grass, then for her peace of mind. I wish I had said no. I returned with more seeds, richer fertilizer, and fresh tools. As I approached the patch, I noticed something strange. The blackened soil had spread. It was subtle, just a few inches beyond where it had been the previous week, but it was spreading. I hesitated, feeling a cold shiver crawl up my spine, but I was determined to fix it. I dug deeper this time, hoping that whatever was wrong might be just below the surface. That's when I hit something hard. At first, I thought it was a rock. I grabbed my trowel and started scraping around it. The more I uncovered, the more I realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was something else, something smoother and flat. It felt unnatural, like stone but colder. I dug around it, uncovering what looked like a large, circular disc buried deep in the earth. It was covered in strange symbols, unlike anything I had ever seen before, and in the center was a small hole, about the size of a coin. I stared at it, my hands trembling, unsure of what to do. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out, brushing the dirt off the surface. As soon as my fingers touched the cold stone, I heard it. A faint whisper, like wind passing through the trees, but it was close, too close. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. The whisper stopped. I should have walked away then. I should have left that place and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed the edge of the disc and tried to lift it. It wouldn't budge at first, but with a little more effort, it began to rise. That's when the ground beneath me started to shake. The black soil, which had remained still all this time, began to churn. I stumbled back as cracks appeared around the patch, widening with each passing second. From deep within the earth, a low, guttural sound rumbled, a growl, almost like something waking up. Panic set in, and I scrambled to my feet, running toward my truck. I could hear it now, louder and clearer. The whispers were no longer soft. They were harsh, insistent, calling me back. I didn't look over my shoulder. I couldn't. I jumped into my truck, started the engine, and sped away, leaving the patch and the cursed ground behind. When I got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker, longer, like they were creeping closer with every passing hour. The next morning, I called Mrs. Hensley to tell her I couldn't finish the job. But when she picked up the phone, her voice was different, cold, distant. She told me the patch had grown overnight, consuming nearly half of her backyard. The black soil had spread like a disease, swallowing everything in its path. I offered to help her find someone else, but she simply hung up, as if she already knew what was coming. That night, I dreamed of the patch. In my dream, I was standing in the center of it, the black soil up to my knees, pulling me down. The whispers were deafening now, screaming in my ears, demanding that I listen, that I understand. I woke up drenched in sweat, but the sound of the whispers lingered in my ears, as if they had followed me out of my dream. Days passed, but the feeling of dread only grew. I avoided going near Mrs. Hensley's house, but I couldn't escape the sense that whatever had been buried in that soil was now a part of me. I started seeing things, dark figures in the corners of my vision, moving shadows that didn't belong. And the whispers, always there, just beneath the surface of my thoughts, pulling me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The last time I drove past her house, I saw that the patch had consumed everything. The black soil stretched across the entire yard, spilling out onto the sidewalk, creeping toward the street. The house itself looked abandoned, the windows dark, the doors shut tight. Mrs. Hensley was gone. I haven't been back since, but the whispers, they haven't stopped. Every time I close my eyes, I see that black soil spreading, reaching for me, pulling me back to that cursed patch of earth. I don't know how much longer I can resist. Whatever is buried there, it's not done with me. And I fear that one day I'll have no choice but to return. And when I do, I know there will be no coming back. I never thought that rearranging furniture could mess with my head. But I'll be honest, I've never dealt with a house like this before. As an interior designer, I've worked in plenty of homes, some with great energy and others that felt a little off. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for this. It all started when I got a call from a client, a young couple named Sarah and Ethan. They had just bought this old Victorian-style house at the edge of town. The kind of house that creaked and groaned in the wind, standing tall like it had its own secrets. They wanted to restore it, make it livable again. Just a bit of rearranging, Sarah had said on the phone. We want to keep the charm, but we also wanted to feel more comfortable. Comfortable. That word haunted me for some reason, because when I arrived, the house felt anything but. The first thing I noticed as I stepped through the door was the air. It was thick, as if the walls were breathing, slowly closing in and then expanding. I chalked it up to old wood settling, but there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The couple, though, seemed unfazed, eagerly showing me around. This is the living room, Ethan said, gesturing to the massive space with its high ceilings and cracked wallpaper. We thought maybe moving the sofa over by the fireplace would open things up. I nodded, already mentally rearranging the space. I've always had a knack for picturing the perfect layout, and this room was no exception. The fireplace was a focal point, but the furniture felt scattered, lost in the vastness of the room. Easy fix, I thought. I spent the next few hours shifting things around. Moving the couch here, placing the armchairs there, bringing in a new coffee table. I stepped back, satisfied with my work. The room felt more balanced, cozy even. But as I admired the changes, I noticed something odd. The walls, had they shifted? No, that's impossible. I shook off the feeling and called Sarah and Ethan in to take a look. They loved it, of course. It feels so much better already, Sarah gushed. More welcoming. I smiled, but inside, I felt a little uneasy. Something about the space wasn't right, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. So I packed up my things and left, promising to come back the next day to tackle the dining room. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the walls. The way they seemed to shift, almost like they were breathing. I convinced myself I was just tired, too much work, not enough sleep. But when I returned the next morning, things got stranger. The moment I walked back into the living room, it felt smaller. Not drastically, but enough that I noticed. The furniture seemed closer together, like the space had shrunk overnight. I stood there for a minute frozen. The walls couldn't have moved. Could they? Everything all right? Ethan's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. Yeah, I said, shaking my head. Just thinking about the dining room. Let's get started. But as we moved through the house, that eerie feeling followed me. Every room I touched, every piece of furniture I shifted, the walls seemed to close in just a little more. It was subtle at first, just a few inches. But by the time I finished the third room, it was undeniable. The rooms were getting smaller. I think we should stop for today, I suggested, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Sarah frowned. But you've only done half the house. I just need to check a few things, I mumbled, backing out of the room. I didn't want to freak them out, but I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I started measuring. Every room, every hallway. I measured the dimensions, comparing them to the blueprints Sarah had given me, and every single room was smaller than it had been the day before. Not by much, just an inch here, half an inch there, but enough to make me dizzy. I didn't tell Sarah or Ethan. Instead, I told myself I was overthinking it. The house was old, maybe it was settling. Maybe the shifting was normal. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the strange shifts, the feeling of being trapped, like the walls were closing in around me. The next morning, I arrived early, before Sarah and Ethan were up. I had to see if the house had changed again overnight. And sure enough, it had. The rooms were even smaller now, so cramped it felt like the house was slowly suffocating itself. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out of there, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a creak behind me. I froze, heart pounding. Slowly, I turned around. The walls were moving. I swear, they were shifting, inching toward me, like they were alive. Panic surged through me, and I ran, straight out the door, into the cold morning air. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I called Sarah later that day, made up some excuse about being sick, and promised to reschedule. But I never did. I was too afraid of what I'd see if I stepped back into that house. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamed of those walls, slowly closing in, trapping me inside. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. And then one day Sarah called me. "Something's wrong with the house," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The rooms, they're smaller. We can barely move in the living room now." I didn't know what to say. How could I explain it to her when I didn't understand it myself? "You need to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Get out of the house." But it was too late. A few days later, I saw the news. Sarah and Ethan were dead. They'd been found in the house, crushed under debris. The walls had caved in on them, trapping them inside. But that wasn't the worst part. The police report said there were no signs of structural damage. No cracks, no faults in the foundation. Nothing to explain why the walls had collapsed. It was like the house had swallowed them whole. I'm writing this now because I need someone to know what happened. I don't care if you believe me or not, I just need to get it off my chest. I've stopped working as a designer. I can't go into houses anymore, not after what I've seen. Every time I step into a room, I feel like the walls are closing in, like they're watching me, waiting for the right moment to trap me inside. Sometimes I wonder if the house is still out there, waiting for its next victim. Maybe it's already found one. All I know is, I'm never going near it again, and neither should you. I've been making pottery for over 20 years. My hands are my tools, shaping, molding, feeling every contour of the clay as if it were a part of me. Pottery isn't just something I do, it's who I am. Every piece, every curve, every indentation is a reflection of myself. That's why I've always been very particular about the clay I use. I run a small pottery studio in a quiet, out-of-the-way town. It's the kind of place where folks barely notice time passing. Tourists sometimes drift in during the summer, but for most of the year, it's just the locals who come by to see what new pieces I've got for sale. Simple bowls, mugs, the occasional vase, things that serve a purpose but still look nice sitting on a kitchen shelf. Life was predictable, routine, even peaceful. That all changed the day I found that strange clay. It was a rainy afternoon, one of those slow days when no one bothered coming by. I was getting ready to pack up when a man walked into the shop. He was drenched, his long coat soaked through, dripping all over the floor. What I noticed first, though, wasn't his appearance. It was the bag he carried, an old burlap sack stained with what looked like mud. "Can I help you?" I asked, glancing at the mess he was leaving on my floor. He didn't say much. Just walked over to the counter and plopped the bag down in front of me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Heard you were the best potter around these parts." I nodded, a little thrown off by his directness. "I like to think I know what I'm doing." He nodded back, not making any effort to explain himself. Instead, he untied the bag and pulled it open, revealing a block of clay inside. It looked odd. Darker than any clay I had ever seen, almost black, with a strange sheen to it, like it was slick with water. "I found this a while back," he said, his voice sounding distant, like he wasn't fully present. "Thought you might want it." I leaned in closer to get a better look. The clay seemed fine, but there was something off about it. It had an odd, earthy smell, not like the usual fresh scent of wet soil. Still, I was intrigued. "Where'd you get this?" "Does it matter?" he asked. The way he said it, it sounded like a challenge. "I guess not," I replied. "How much?" He shook his head. "Consider it a gift." That should have been my first warning, but I was curious. I took the bag, thanked him, and watched as he turned and disappeared into the rain. I didn't start using the clay right away. I'm not one to jump into new materials without testing them first. But the more I looked at that block, sitting on my workbench, the more it called to me. It wasn't like regular clay. It didn't dry out. Even after sitting there for days, it stayed soft, pliable, as if it were constantly wet. It seemed like a perfect medium, something I could work with without the rush to finish before it hardened. I couldn't resist anymore. I decided to make a vase, something simple to start with. As my hands worked the clay, I felt an odd sensation, like the clay was moving on its own, subtly shifting under my fingers. It wasn't unpleasant, just strange, like it had its own life. I shaked it, smoothed it, and everything seemed fine until I set it aside to dry. That's when I noticed the first crack. At first it was small, barely noticeable, but as the vase sat there, the crack grew, and then another appeared, and another. Thin, intersecting lines spread across the surface like a spider web slowly covering the entire piece. I was frustrated but figured it was a one-time thing. Maybe I didn't handle the clay right. I tried again, this time making a bowl. Same result. The cracks came back, snaking their way through the piece, forming intricate patterns that didn't make any sense. It became a pattern. Every time I worked with the clay, it cracked. No matter what I made, a vase, a cup, a sculpture, the pieces would fracture, and the cracks always formed strange, intersecting lines. They looked almost intentional, like some kind of design etched into the surface, but I knew I wasn't responsible for them. After a while, I began to notice something else. The cracks, they weren't just random. They seemed to form symbols. At first, I didn't believe it. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I looked at the pieces, the more I realized the lines had a pattern, a purpose. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something about those cracks bothered me, like they were trying to tell me something. And then, things got worse. It started with dreams. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, though I couldn't remember what I had been dreaming about. All I knew was that the cracks were there, in my mind, etched into my subconscious. I'd see them even when I closed my eyes. One night, I woke up to a noise in the studio. I grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs, figuring maybe I had left a window open and the wind had knocked something over. When I stepped into the studio, though, everything was still. But the pieces weren't where I had left them. The vases, bowls, and sculptures, all the things I had made with that cursed clay, they had moved. They were arranged on the floor, positioned in a perfect circle, the cracks in each piece lined up to form a massive, intricate symbol that filled the room. I backed away, my heart racing, but I tripped and fell. As I hit the ground, the flashlight rolled out of my hand, its beam landing on one of the pieces. And then I saw it. The cracks weren't just symbols, they were moving. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the flashlight, shining it directly on the vase in front of me. The cracks wriggled and writhed, shifting ever so slightly, as if the lines were alive, crawling under the surface of the clay like worms burrowing through soil. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a hammer and started smashing the pieces. One by one, I shattered the vases, bowls, and sculptures until there was nothing left but shards of clay scattered across the floor. But even then, the cracks didn't disappear. The lines still twitched, connecting the fragments in some horrible, unseen way. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I called in sick and stayed home, trying to convince myself it had all been a bad dream. But as the hours passed, I knew that wasn't true. Something had followed me, something from that clay. The next night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, like voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The sound came from the studio. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the bag of clay, the same burlap sack the man had left me, and drove out of town. I didn't stop until I reached a river deep in the woods. Without thinking, I hurled the bag into the water, watching as it disappeared into the current. I thought that was the end of it. But when I got back to the studio, the cracks were still there, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. They had spread, seeping into the very foundation of the building. No matter where I looked, the lines followed, creeping into every corner, twisting and intersecting like a map to some unknown place. And then I realized the cracks weren't just in the studio. They were on me. I looked down at my hands, and there they were, thin, dark lines tracing their way up my arms, crawling across my skin like veins. I screamed, clawing at them, trying to scratch them away, but they didn't budge. They were inside me, a part of me now. The last thing I remember is the feeling of the cracks tightening, closing in, as if the clay was consuming me from the inside out. Now I'm just another piece, another broken thing, waiting for the next set of cracks to appear. And they will.